The morning mist still clung to Sagebrush Valley when 3 rapid-fire shots echoed through the canyons. From a distance, onlookers would see only a lone rider, a slender woman astride a magnificent palomino, her rifle raised toward a line of distant targets. In less than a breath, all 3 targets lay shattered, the woman already holstering her weapon with practiced grace. The few who witnessed such displays knew to keep their distance from Eleanor Reed's small ranch on the outskirts of Copper Springs. But the Blackwell gang, newly arrived in the territory, hadn't yet learned that the quiet widow with the prized palomino was once known throughout the Western Circuit as the Golden Whirlwind, the most decorated mounted sharpshooter the territories had ever seen. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The first light of dawn painted Copper Springs in hues of amber and gold as Eleanor Reed began her morning routine. The small ranch house she'd inherited from her late husband James stood on 20 acres of rocky but workable land at the edge of Sagebrush Valley. Unlike the sprawling cattle operations that dominated the territory, Eleanor's modest homestead consisted of little more than the weathered 2-story house, a small but meticulously maintained stable, and a fenced training ring where weathered targets hung at varying distances. Eleanor moved through her morning chores with quiet efficiency, her movements precise and economical. At 42, her honey-brown hair now carried strands of silver, often swept back into a practical braid that hung halfway down her back. Her simple cotton dress and worn leather boots marked her as just another hard-working widow trying to make ends meet in a harsh territory. But there was something distinctive in her bearing, a certain alertness in her hazel eyes, a fluidity to her movements that spoke of a different kind of training than most ranch women possessed. Inside the stable, Eleanor ran a practiced hand along the gleaming coat of Sundance, her palomino gelding. The horse wasn't merely her only valuable possession. He was her partner, her connection to a past life she'd left behind 5 years ago when James had unexpectedly died of fever. "Just us again today, old friend," she murmured as she worked the curry brush through Sundance's golden coat with practiced strokes. The horse nickered softly, nudging her shoulder with familiar affection. Unlike the sturdy workhorses most ranchers favored, Sundance was something special. 17 hands of muscled speed and intelligence, with the rare combination of nerves steady enough to handle gunfire and agility precise enough for the complex maneuvers of mounted shooting. His bloodline traced back to some of the finest quarter horses in Texas, and even those who knew nothing of Eleanor's past recognized that Sundance was an animal worth 10 ordinary horses. "Mrs. Reed, are you there?" a young voice called from outside. "By the tack wall, Charlie," Eleanor replied, continuing her grooming without missing a stroke. Charlie Parker, the 16-year-old son of Copper Springs general store owner, appeared in the stable doorway, his lanky frame silhouetted against the morning light. The boy had been helping around Eleanor's ranch for the past 3 years, earning extra money and learning horsemanship from a woman most in town simply regarded as having an unusual knack with horses. "Pa sent me to tell you the supply wagon arrived early. Your feed order's ready whenever you want to collect it." The boy's eyes drifted admiringly to Sundance. "Also thought you might want to know there's some new fellas in town. Rode last night, taking up at Holloway's old place by Thunder Creek." Eleanor's hands paused momentarily in their grooming. "How many?" "7 that I counted, led by a man calling himself Jackson Blackwell, throwing money around at Miller's Saloon like it grows on trees." Charlie shifted uncomfortably. "Pa says they're saying they're horse traders, but Sheriff Thompson's keeping an eye on them. Something about them matching descriptions from a telegraph out of Denver." Eleanor resumed her grooming, her expression revealing nothing of the sudden alertness that had come over her. Appreciate the information, Charlie. I'll head into town for that feed after I finish up here. After Charlie left, Eleanor moved to the small wooden chest kept in the corner of the stable. With practiced hands, she unlocked it, revealing not the expected brushes and horse medicines, but a custom-tooled gun belt holding matching Remington revolvers and boxes of ammunition. Beneath lay a polished Winchester rifle with intricate scrollwork along its barrel, not the practical weapon of a frontier settler, but the competition arm of a professional. 5 years she'd been in Copper Springs. 5 years since she'd stepped away from the mounted shooting circuit where she'd once been celebrated as the Golden Whirlwind. 5 years of quiet anonymity, maintaining the small ranch James had loved, participating in local gatherings just enough to be considered a reclusive but respectable widow rather than an oddity. 5 years of practicing her shooting only at dawn, when the sound of gunfire could be dismissed as hunting or protection against predators. Only Doc Sullivan knew the truth about her past. As the town physician who had treated James in his final days, he'd recognized her from a competition in St. Louis years earlier. He'd kept her secret, understanding her desire for privacy after the tragedy that had driven her from the circuit. It wasn't just James's death that had pushed Eleanor to seek anonymity in this remote corner of the territory. It was what had happened after, in that final championship in Kansas City. The memory still visited her in nightmares. The crack of gunfire, the screams, the young competitor who'd challenged her champion status with whiskey-fueled bravado and a loaded revolver after she'd publicly refused his advances. The fact that she'd disarmed him without taking his life had made the newspapers call her actions heroic, but Eleanor had seen only tragedy in her skill. A young man's promising future ended with a prison sentence, and the unwanted attention that had followed her afterward. Eleanor closed the chest, locking away both the weapons and the memories. Sundance nudged her shoulder again, as if sensing the sudden tension in his mistress. "Just a bit of the past catching up, old friend," she murmured, patting his neck. "Nothing for us to worry about." But as she saddled Sundance for the ride into town, Eleanor found herself checking the small derringer she kept concealed in her boot, a habit she'd nearly abandoned in recent years. Something about Charlie's news had awakened old instincts, the wariness that comes from years of traveling alone as a female champion through territories where fame attracted as much danger as it did admiration. As Sundance's hooves kicked up, small clouds of dust on the trail to Copper Springs, Eleanor scanned the horizon with practiced eyes. The horse traders settling at the old Holloway place meant they were less than 3 miles from her small ranch, close enough to notice the exceptional quality of her palomino, but hopefully far enough that their business, whatever it truly was, would keep them occupied elsewhere. What Eleanor couldn't know, as she guided Sundance toward the weathered buildings of Copper Springs appearing on the horizon, was that at that very moment, Jackson Blackwell was standing on the porch of Holloway's abandoned homestead, spyglass raised toward the distant figure of a woman riding a gleaming palomino. "That's her, boss," said a wiry man with a jagged scar running down his cheek. "Widow woman on the small spread north of town. Locals say she keeps to herself, but word is that palomino of hers is something special." Jackson Blackwell lowered the spyglass, a calculating smile spreading across his face. "Well, boys, it seems we might have found exactly what we're looking for. That horse would fetch a pretty price in Denver. Might even be worth delaying our other business in this backwater town." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. What the Blackwell gang didn't realize was that they weren't the first to covet Eleanor Reed's prized palomino, nor would they be the first to discover that the quiet widow's attachment to her horse was matched only by her ability to protect. What was hers Copper Springs wasn't much as frontier towns went, a single dusty main street lined with weathered buildings, a testament to the stubborn perseverance of those who'd planted roots in this harsh corner of the territory. Eleanor guided Sundance down the center of town, nodding politely to the familiar faces she passed. The Palomino's hooves clacked rhythmically against the hard-packed dirt, his golden coat gleaming in the mid-morning sun. As she approached Parker's general store, Eleanor noted the unfamiliar horses hitched outside Miller's saloon across the street, muscular, well-bred animals that stood out among the practical workhorses typically found in Copper Springs. Their quality saddles and elaborate tack spoke of men who valued appearance and weren't shy about displaying their wealth. "Morning, Mrs. Reed," Samuel Parker called from the porch of his general store as Eleanor dismounted. The shopkeeper's round face creased in a friendly smile beneath his neatly trimmed mustache. "Charlie mentioned he told you about your feed. Order, I've got it all ready. Thank you, Mr. Parker." Eleanor looped Sundance's reins around the hitching post. "I appreciate the notification." Parker's eyes darted briefly toward the saloon, lowering his voice as Eleanor approached. "Suppose Charlie also mentioned our new visitors, calling themselves horse traders. But I've been running this store long enough to recognize men who carry themselves like they're used to trouble." "He mentioned something about it," Eleanor replied, her tone neutral even as her eyes carefully assessed the saloon's entrance. "Sheriff Thompson sent a telegram to Denver asking about them," Parker continued, helping Eleanor load the feed sacks onto Sundance's pack saddle. "Figure it can't hurt to be cautious with strangers these days." The bat-wing doors of the saloon swung open, and 3 men emerged, their laughter cutting through the morning quiet. Eleanor didn't turn to look, but she registered their presence, with the peripheral awareness that had once kept her alive during her years traveling alone on the circuit. "Well now, ain't that a fine-looking animal?" A deep voice drawled loudly enough to be heard across the street. Eleanor continued securing the feed sacks, her movements unhurried and methodical. "Ma'am," the voice called, closer now. "Might I inquire about that exceptional Palomino?" With practiced composure, Eleanor turned to face the speaker. Jackson Blackwell stood a few paces away, flanked by 2 men whose relaxed postures couldn't quite hide the readiness in their stance. Blackwell himself cut an imposing figure, tall and broad-shouldered, with a carefully trimmed beard and expensive clothes that seemed at odds with the rugged frontier town. A silver-plated revolver hung low on his hip, positioned for quick access rather than for show. "My horse isn't for sale, Mr." Eleanor let the question hang in the air. "Blackwell. Jackson Blackwell," he replied with a tip of his hat and a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Premier horse trader out of Denver, and I haven't yet mentioned buying, ma'am, though I'd be remiss in my profession if I didn't express appreciation for such fine horseflesh." "Thank you for the compliment," Eleanor replied evenly, "but as I said, Sundance isn't for sale at any price." Blackwell stepped closer, his assessment now clearly encompassing both horse and rider. "Sundance, fitting name for such a golden beauty. May I ask where you acquired an animal of this quality? Such bloodlines are rare in these parts." "He was a gift from my late husband," Eleanor answered, the partial truth easier than explaining that Sundance had been her competition partner during her years on the circuit. "My condolences on your loss," Blackwell said, performing a reasonable facsimile of respect. "Must be difficult managing a ranch alone. If you ever reconsider your position on selling, my associates and I will be at the old Holloway place for the next week or so." His gaze swept over Sundance once more. "I'd be prepared to offer a very generous sum, enough perhaps to make life considerably more comfortable. As I said, Mr. Blackwell, he's not for sale." Eleanor's tone remained polite but firm. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I need to finish my business in town." Blackwell smiled again, stepping back with exaggerated courtesy. "Of course, Mrs. Reed, Eleanor Reed, Mrs. Reed." He tipped his hat again. I look forward to seeing you around town." As Blackwell and his men returned to the saloon, Samuel Parker moved closer to Eleanor, his expression troubled. "Be careful around that one. Mrs. Reed, something about his eyes reminds me of a rattler sizing up its next meal." Eleanor nodded, finishing the task of securing her supplies. "I appreciate the warning, Mr. Parker. There's something else you should know," Parker added, glancing toward the saloon to ensure they weren't overheard. "They've been asking questions about local horse owners, particularly those with quality stock. Tom Wilson already had a visit out at his place yesterday, said they were mighty insistent about seeing his thoroughbred mare, even after he declined to show her." A chill ran down Eleanor's spine that had nothing to do with the morning air. "Has Sheriff Thompson been informed?" "He has, but with no crime committed yet, there's little he can do besides keep an eye on them." Parker hesitated. "Perhaps you might consider moving Sundance to one of the larger ranches until these men move."
"What?"
"The Bradley spread has good security, and Harold always spoke highly of you after you helped his daughter with her riding." Eleanor shook her head. "Thank you for your concern, but Sundance stays with me. We'll be fine." As she prepared to mount, a commotion from the far end of the street caught her attention. A young woman was struggling with a spirited bay horse that had been spooked by something, the animal rearing and threatening to bolt through town. "That's Lily Thompson, the sheriff's daughter," Parker said with alarm. "That new mare of hers is still half wild." Without hesitation, Eleanor handed her reins to Parker and moved swiftly toward the panicking horse. The young woman was clinging desperately to the reins, trying to maintain control as the bay danced and spun in the middle of the street. "Easy now," Eleanor called out, approaching from an angle visible to the frightened animal. "Don't pull on." "The reins, you're scaring her more. Mrs. Reed." Lily's voice was tight with fear. "I can't. She won't." "Release the pressure gradually," Eleanor instructed calmly, moving closer with smooth, deliberate steps. "That's it. Now breathe deeply. She can sense your fear." Eleanor positioned herself strategically, using her body language to create a channel for the horse's energy. With practiced movements, she gradually took control of the situation, speaking in low, soothing tones that seemed to penetrate the animal's panic. Within moments, the bay was standing still, nostrils flaring but no longer attempting to bolt. Eleanor ran a practiced hand along its neck, murmuring words too soft for onlookers to hear. "How did you do that?" Lily asked in amazement, as Eleanor handed the now calm reins back to her. "Horses are mirrors," Eleanor replied simply. "They reflect what's around them. Fear creates fear. Calm creates calm." A small crowd had gathered to watch the exchange, including Blackwell and his men, who had emerged once more from the saloon. Eleanor felt Blackwell's calculating gaze on her, as she demonstrated to Lily how to properly hold the reins and position her body to maintain the horse's confidence. "Remarkable horsemanship, Mrs. Reed," Blackwell commented as Eleanor finished her impromptu lesson. "Your skills extend beyond mere ownership, I see." "Anyone who keeps horses learns a thing or two," Eleanor replied casually, though she was acutely aware that she had revealed more of her expertise than she'd intended. Indeed, Blackwell smiled, exchanging a meaningful glance with one of his companions. "Indeed they do." As Eleanor returned to Sundance and mounted up, she could feel Blackwell's eyes following her every movement, assessing the effortless way she took her seat and gathered the reins. The practiced precision she'd developed over thousands of hours. In the saddle was second nature now, impossible to fully disguise, even after years of trying to appear as nothing more than a simple widow. Riding back toward her ranch, Eleanor's mind raced with unwelcome possibilities. Blackwell wasn't simply a horse trader with an eye for quality stock. The way he carried himself, the calculating assessment in his gaze, the quality of the weapons his men carried, all suggested a man accustomed to taking what he wanted, legal means or otherwise. As Sundance crested the hill that overlooked her small ranch, Eleanor made a decision. Tonight, she would unpack more than just the practicalities. From her past, the time had come to acknowledge that skills kept hidden were of no use when trouble came calling. Dusk settled over Eleanor's ranch, painting the weathered buildings in shades of purple and gold. After unsaddling Sundance and ensuring he was comfortable for the night, Eleanor secured the stable with more care than usual, checking the heavy wooden bar across the door twice and testing the locks on the windows that dotted the structure's weathered sides. Inside her modest ranch house, she lit a lamp and moved to the small hearth, stoking the banked coals into a flame to ward off the evening's gathering chill. The house was simple but well-maintained, containing little that suggested anything beyond the life of a practical widow of modest means, save for a single photograph on the mantel showing a younger Eleanor astride Sundance, holding a trophy, almost obscured by the frame's position. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. Eleanor approached cautiously, removing the small derringer from her boot and concealing it in the folds of her skirt before speaking through the solid oak barrier. "Who's there?" "It's me, Eleanor. Doc Sullivan." Relief washed over her as she recognized the familiar voice of Copper Springs' aging physician. She opened the door to reveal Walter Sullivan, a man in his 60s with kind blue eyes and silver hair that framed a face weathered by decades of frontier medicine. "Evening, Walter. This is an unexpected visit." Eleanor stepped aside to let him enter, noting the concern etched on his features. "Thought I should ride out and check on you," he said, removing his hat as he stepped inside. "Heard about your encounter with Blackwell and his men in town today." Eleanor gestured for him to take a seat at her small kitchen table. "News travels fast." "Small towns," Sullivan replied with a wry smile that quickly faded. "Samuel Parker stopped by my office specifically to mention it. He's worried, Eleanor. So am I." Eleanor moved to the stove, stoking the fire beneath a kettle. "I appreciate the concern, but I've handled unwanted attention before." Sullivan studied her with the knowing gaze of someone who held confidence. "Not since Kansas City, you haven't." The mention of that place hung in the air between them. Eleanor's hands stilled momentarily before she resumed preparing 2 cups. "For tea." "That was different," she said quietly, her back still turned to him. "Was it?" Sullivan leaned forward. "Eleanor, I've known you since you arrived in Copper Springs. I've respected your desire for privacy, your wish to leave your past behind. But these men, there's something you should know about them." The seriousness in his tone made Eleanor turn to face him. "The telegraph came through just before I rode out here," Sullivan continued. "Sheriff Thompson's inquiry to Denver got a response. The Blackwell Gang, that's what they're known as. They're wanted in 3 territories: horse theft, armed robbery, worse things left unmentioned in polite company." Eleanor's expression remained composed, though her mind raced with the implications. "And they've set their sights on Sundance." "Not just Sundance," Sullivan corrected grimly. "According to the telegram, they operate by identifying valuable horses, then using them as leverage against their owners. Force them to open their safes, turn over their valuables. Sometimes they take the horses too, sell them across territorial lines where they can't be easily traced." The kettle began to whistle. Eleanor removed it from the heat, pouring steaming water into the waiting cups before joining Sullivan at the table. "Sheriff Thompson's organizing a posse," Sullivan continued, wrapping his weathered hands around the warm cup. "But they were spotted heading in the direction of the Holloway place with supplies. He thinks they may lie low for a day or 2, planning whatever they're here to do." "Which brings us to why you're really here," Eleanor said, meeting his gaze. "Directly. You're not just warning me. You're suggesting I leave, take Sundance and go until this blows over." Sullivan sighed, the sound carrying the weight of difficult truths. "I'm suggesting you consider your options carefully. These men, they're dangerous, Eleanor, and they've already taken an interest in you and that horse. Running isn't always the answer, Walter. Neither is standing alone against 7 armed men, he countered, concern evident in his voice. Not even for someone with your particular skills. Eleanor's gaze drifted to the mantelpiece, to the partially obscured photograph. Those skills are part of a life I left behind for good reason. I know why you walked away, Sullivan said softly. After James died, after that young fool challenged you in Kansas City, and you were forced to use your abilities in a way you never intended. I understood why you needed peace, why you chose Copper Springs to disappear into. He reached across the table, his physician's hands gentle but insistent as they covered hers. But sometimes the past has value, Eleanor. Sometimes the skills we try to leave behind are exactly what's needed to face what lies ahead. Eleanor withdrew her hands, rising to fetch a small wooden box from a shelf. She placed it on the table between them, running her fingers over its polished surface before opening it. Inside lay a collection of newspaper clippings and small medallions, the documented history of the Golden Whirlwind and her unprecedented career on the mounted shooting circuit. 4 consecutive territorial championships, Sullivan murmured, looking at the familiar clippings. 17 exhibition records that still stand unbroken. You weren't just good, Eleanor. You were the best anyone had ever seen. And what did it get me? Eleanor's voice remained steady, but her eyes reflected old pain. Fame I never wanted. Men challenging me to prove themselves. And ultimately, a young man's life was ruined because he couldn't accept being bested by a woman. You didn't ruin his life, Sullivan reminded her gently. He made his choice when he drew on you after that competition. You could have killed him. You had every right to. Instead, you shot the gun from his hand with such precision that even the territorial marshal couldn't believe what he'd witnessed. It doesn't change the outcome, Eleanor replied, closing the box with finality. The notoriety that followed, the spectacle they tried to make of me, it was everything James and I had tried to avoid, everything we came west to escape. Sullivan's expression softened with understanding. Your husband was a good man. He recognized your extraordinary talent with horses and firearms as something to be respected, not exploited. But he also wouldn't have wanted you to bury those gifts entirely, especially not when they might be needed to protect yourself and what you've built here. A comfortable silence settled between them as Eleanor considered his words. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying the familiar sounds of the high country night. There's something else, Sullivan said finally. Something the telegram mentioned, that I think you should know. The Blackwell gang, they're not just thieves. Their leader, Jackson, fancies himself something of a duelist, takes special pleasure in forcing confrontations, particularly with those who have reputations to defend. Eleanor's eyes narrowed slightly. You think he knows who I am? Sullivan shook his head. Not yet, but he's clearly recognized that you're more than just a widow with a fine horse. The way you handled that situation with Lily Thompson's mare. Today, people noticed. Blackwell most of all. He leaned forward, his expression grave. What concerns me is what happens if he does discover your past. The telegram mentioned 3 men who faced him in forced duels. None survived, and witnesses reported the confrontations were engineered to appear as though his victims drew first. Eleanor absorbed this information, her tactical mind already assessing implications. So Sheriff Thompson is forming a posse, but Blackwell and his men are lying low, which means they're planning something, likely within the next day or 2. That's how I read it, Sullivan agreed. Thompson set watches on the roads, but he can't spare men to guard individual properties, not with 7 potential threats to account for. Eleanor walked to the window, gazing out at the stable where Sundance was sheltered. The moonlight silvered the landscape, casting long shadows from the cottonwoods that lined the property's edge. I won't leave, Walter, she said finally, her voice carrying quiet resolve. "This ranch was James's dream. It's all I have left of him. And Sundance," she paused, gathering her thoughts. "He's more than just a valuable horse to me. He's my partner, my friend." Sullivan nodded, unsurprised by her decision. "Then I suppose the question becomes not whether you'll stand your ground, but how." Eleanor turned from the window, her expression transformed by quiet determination. "I think it's time to retrieve some things from the attic. Things I put away 5 years ago, hoping never to need again." As Sullivan prepared to depart, he paused at the door. "You know, Eleanor, there's a difference between seeking the spotlight and accepting that sometimes our unique abilities exist for a purpose. James understood that about you, even if you've forgotten it yourself." After the doctor's departure, Eleanor climbed to the small attic space above her bedroom. In the far corner, beneath a canvas tarp, lay a long wooden trunk secured with a padlock, the key she wore on a chain around her neck, never removed, even after all these years. The lock opened with a decisive click. Inside, carefully preserved, lay the equipment of the Golden Whirlwind, customized rifle, matched revolvers, hand-tooled leather gun belt, and the distinctive side-saddle rigs that had revolutionized women's mounted shooting. Beneath these rested a folded garment of golden-brown suede, the riding outfit that had become her trademark on the circuit. Eleanor ran her fingers over the worn leather, memories flooding back of pounding hooves, the crack of gunfire, the perfect harmony between horse and rider that had made her legendary. Skills honed through thousands of hours of practice didn't simply disappear. They waited, dormant but preserved, like seeds in winter soil. Tomorrow, she decided, it was time for the Golden Whirlwind to ride again, not for fame or trophies, but to protect what mattered most. Dawn found Eleanor in her training ring behind the stable, moving through exercises she hadn't performed in half a decade. The wooden targets, weathered but intact, stood at varying distances around the circular enclosure. Her body remembered what her mind had tried to forget, muscle memory guiding her through the familiar motions of drawing, aiming, and firing. In one fluid sequence, the matched revolvers felt like extensions of her hands, their weight and balance exactly as she recalled. 3 rapid shots split the morning stillness, striking dead center on targets positioned 30 yards apart. Eleanor assessed her work with a critical eye. Not perfect, a half-inch off on the 3rd target, but better than most professionals. Good manage after years of consistent practice. She holstered the revolvers and moved to Sundance's stall. The Palomino greeted her with an eager wicker, sensing something different in his mistress's demeanor. "Been a while since we danced together properly, old friend," Eleanor murmured, running a hand along his golden neck. "Let's see if we still remember the steps." She proceeded to saddle Sundance with the specialized rig she'd retrieved from the trunk, a modified design that allowed for both the traditional side saddle position favored during her exhibition days and the more practical, astride riding necessary for actual combat. The tack incorporated custom holsters and ammunition loops positioned for lightning-fast access while mounted. Leading Sundance to the training ring, Eleanor took a deep breath before mounting with practiced grace. She settled into the saddle, feeling the familiar connection between horse and rider, a partnership forged through thousands of hours of training and competition. "Ready?" she whispered. Sundance's ears flicked back at her voice, his body tensing slightly in anticipation. Eleanor gave the subtle cue, a slight pressure of her left knee combined with the gentlest tug on the reins. The response was immediate. Sundance moved forward into a collected lope, his stride smooth and controlled as they began circling the ring. Eleanor started with basic maneuvers, guiding Sundance through figure-eights and tight turns, using primarily leg pressure and weight. Shifts, leaving her hands free. With each completed pattern, the Palomino's movements became more fluid, his responses more instantaneous, as horse and rider rediscovered their extraordinary connection. After 20 minutes of increasingly complex patterns, Eleanor drew one of her revolvers. The familiar weight in her hand, while mounted, awakened deeper muscle memories. The intricate coordination required to maintain perfect balance, control a 1,000-pound animal through precise maneuvers, and place shots with pinpoint accuracy. She nudged Sundance into a faster gait. As they passed the first target, she fired. Without slowing, they swept past the second and third targets, each receiving a single, precisely placed shot. 5 targets, 5 shots, all within a handful of seconds, and every bullet found its mark. Eleanor allowed herself a small smile of satisfaction. The skills remained, perhaps somewhat dulled by disuse, but still exceptional by any standard. By midday, after several hours of increasingly demanding practice, she felt the old rhythm returning. The seamless harmony between horse, rider, and firearms that had once made the Golden Whirlwind a name whispered with awe throughout the territories. As she dismounted to inspect the targets more closely, the sound of approaching hoofbeats caught her attention. She swiftly secured her firearms beneath a canvas tarp before turning to face the trail that led to her property. Sheriff Thompson appeared, riding a sturdy chestnut gelding. The lawman's weathered face registered surprise at finding Eleanor in the training ring rather than tending to her usual morning chores. "Mrs. Reed," he called in greeting, tipping his hat as he dismounted. "Hope I'm not intruding." "Not at all, Sheriff," Eleanor replied, adjusting her simple work shirt to ensure no evidence of her practice session remained visible. "What brings you out this way?" Thompson secured his horse before approaching. "Thought you should know the Blackwell gang's been making inquiries about you in town." "Specific inquiries?" Eleanor's expression remained neutral. "What kind of inquiries?" "The kind that suggests they've developed more than a passing interest in your Palomino." Thompson's eyes drifted to Sundance, who stood alert but calm in the training ring. "But there's something else. One of my deputies overheard them asking Parker about your background. How long you've been in these parts, where you came from." "I see." Eleanor kept her voice steady. "And what prompted this sudden curiosity?" "Apparently there was quite a bit of talk about how you handled Lily's mare yesterday." A hint of fatherly pride crossed the sheriff's face at the mention of his daughter. "She hasn't stopped talking about it. Says you have a way with horses like nothing she's ever seen. Seems that caught Blackwell's attention." Thompson hesitated, then continued. "There's something else. A telegram came through from the marshal's office in Kansas City this morning. Seems they've been tracking Blackwell's movements for some time. They believe he's not just after horses. He's building a reputation by targeting noted gunmen, forcing confrontations where he can claim self-defense." Eleanor's heartbeat quickened slightly. "And what does that have to do with me?" "Probably nothing," Thompson conceded. "But Marshal Jenkins specifically asked if we'd seen any sign of a woman matching a certain description, a former exhibition shooter known as the Golden Whirlwind." The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken questions. Eleanor met Thompson's gaze steadily, neither confirming nor denying the obvious connection. "Interesting coincidence," she finally remarked, her tone carefully measured. Thompson nodded slowly. "That's what I thought. Told the telegraph operator to reply that no such person had been seen in Copper Springs." He studied her with newfound respect. "Your business is your own, Mrs. Reed. Always has been. But if Blackwell is hunting for famous, gun hands to challenge, and if he somehow connects you to this Golden Whirlwind—" "I appreciate the warning, Sheriff," Eleanor said. "And your discretion. Just doing my job." Thompson glanced around her property with a professional eye. "I've stationed deputies at strategic points around town, but I can't spare anyone for individual homesteads. If you'd consider moving into town until this situation resolves—" "That won't be necessary," Eleanor interrupted gently. "I'll be fine here." Thompson looked as though he might argue, then thought better of it. "At least accept these," he said, reaching into his saddlebag to withdraw a box of ammunition. "Standard issue, but better than nothing if trouble comes calling." Eleanor accepted the offering with a nod of thanks, knowing it would be impolite to refuse, despite having far superior ammunition already in her possession. "One last thing," Thompson added, as he prepared to depart. "Blackwell and two of his men were asking about the routes between town and outlying properties, specifically mentioned the trail that passes by your place on the way to the high country." His expression grew grave. "I'd keep a sharp eye out, Mrs. Reed. These men, they're not just thieves, they're predators." After the sheriff's departure, Eleanor returned to the house and carefully unpacked more items from her trunk. Beyond the firearms and specialized tack, she retrieved several small leather pouches containing the custom ammunition she'd once used exclusively in competition, rounds hand-loaded to her precise specifications for unmatched accuracy and reliability. Moving to the windows, she methodically checked lines of sight from each one, mentally calculating distances and angles to various points on her property. The small ranch house had been built with practical frontier concerns in mind. Thick walls of hand-hewn logs, windows positioned to allow defensive fire if necessary, and a root cellar accessible from inside that could serve as a fallback position, if needed. As afternoon shadows lengthened across her property, Eleanor systematically placed weapons at strategic points throughout the house. A shotgun behind the kitchen door, one of her competition revolvers in a drawer beside her bed, the Winchester rifle mounted on discreet hooks beneath the front window that offered the best view of the approach to her property. Returning to the training ring, she worked with Sundance on the most challenging maneuvers of mounted shooting, the precision stops and starts, the explosive bursts of speed followed. By instant collection, the tight turns executed at full gallop. By sunset, both horse and rider were physically spent, but mentally reconnected, their legendary partnership reawakened after years of dormancy. As darkness fell, Eleanor brushed down Sundance with particular care, checking every inch of his magnificent form before securing him in his stall for the night. Instead of returning to the house, however, she climbed to the stable's small loft and settled beside the window that overlooked the trail approaching her property. From a burlap sack, she withdrew provisions for a long night's watch: jerky, hardtack, and a canteen of water. Beside her lay the Winchester, loaded and ready. The moon cast silver light across the landscape, illuminating the trail where it emerged from a stand of pines, some 400 yards from her position. Eleanor hadn't survived nearly a decade as a woman traveling alone through frontier territories without developing a keen sense for danger. Something in Thompson's warning, combined with her own instincts, told her that Blackwell wouldn't wait long to make his move. Men like him operated on intimidation and surprise, and having made his interest in Sundance known, he would expect her to be fearful, perhaps even panicked. What he couldn't know was that Eleanor Reed had faced far more dangerous men than Jackson Blackwell during her years on the circuit. Behind the quiet widow's facade lay the calculating mind of a woman who had navigated the complex and often deadly world of exhibition shooting, a realm where jealousy, challenged pride, and substantial prize money combined to create dangers far beyond the competition itself. As she settled in for her vigil, Eleanor recalled Doc Sullivan's words from the previous evening. Perhaps her exceptional skills hadn't been meant to be hidden away after all. Perhaps they existed for precisely this moment, not for fame or glory, but for protection, for survival. The night deepened, stars wheeling overhead as Eleanor maintained her watch alert and ready. The golden whirlwind hadn't sought this confrontation, but she would not shrink from it. Some battles couldn't be avoided. They could only be faced with all the skill and courage one possessed. The attack came just before dawn, when darkness was beginning to yield to the first hints of morning light. Eleanor had maintained her vigil through the night, catching brief moments of rest while never fully surrendering to sleep. Her vigilance was rewarded when she detected the subtle shifting of shadows along the tree line, movement too deliberate to be wildlife, too cautious to be innocent travelers. 3 figures emerged from the pines, leading their horses at a walk to minimize sound. They paused at the edge of the clearing, conferring in hushed tones before separating, one heading toward the house, 2 angling toward the stable where Sundance was kept. Their approach was tactical, clearly planned to surround the property before the occupant awakened. Eleanor's pulse quickened, but her hands remained steady as she lifted the Winchester to her shoulder. Through the scope, she could make out the features of Jackson Blackwell himself, leading the pair, approaching the stable. The third man, the wiry one with the jagged facial scar, was creeping toward her house, revolver already drawn. She had anticipated this, not a direct confrontation, but a pre-dawn raid designed to secure Sundance with minimal resistance. They likely planned to use the horse as leverage, perhaps even take him away before she discovered the theft. A standard approach for experienced horse thieves, but one that revealed they had underestimated their target. Eleanor centered the rifle's sight on the ground, 3 feet ahead of Blackwell's careful approach. Drawing a measured breath, she squeezed the trigger. The shot shattered the pre-dawn stillness, kicking up dirt exactly where she'd aimed. Close enough to send a message, far enough to make her intentions clear. "That's close enough, Mr. Blackwell," she called out, her voice carrying clearly in the morning air. "The next one won't miss." The 3 men froze, then scattered for cover, professional reflexes revealing their experience with ambushes. Blackwell and his companion dove behind the water trough near the stable, while the scarred man flattened himself against the side of her house. "Mrs. Reed?" Blackwell's voice held surprised recognition. "My apologies for the early hour. We were just admiring your fine property." "Most admirers don't arrive armed before sunrise," Eleanor replied evenly, shifting position slightly to maintain visual contact with all 3 men. Nor do they attempt to approach unannounced. A low chuckle drifted up from Blackwell's position. "Seems we've misunderstood each other. My associates and I are early risers. Thought we might discuss business before you started your day." "Business conducted at gunpoint isn't business, Mr. Blackwell. It's robbery." A tense silence followed her words. Eleanor used the moment to assess her tactical situation. The man at the house was the most immediate threat, positioned where he could potentially enter if she became distracted. Blackwell and his companion were better contained near the water trough, with limited movement options without exposing themselves. "You got us all wrong, Mrs. Reed," Blackwell called again, his tone shifting to something harder. "We're simply interested in that magnificent palomino of yours, willing to pay handsomely too, more than he's worth to a widow struggling to maintain a ranch alone. And if I decline your generous offer?" Eleanor kept her rifle trained on the water trough, but her awareness encompassed all 3 intruders. "Then things might get unnecessarily complicated," Blackwell replied, an edge entering his voice. "Accidents happen on isolated properties. Fires, injuries, sometimes worse." The threat hung in the air, its implications clear. Eleanor had faced such intimidation before during her years on the circuit, men who believed that a woman alone was inherently vulnerable, easily frightened into compliance. "I should mention," she said calmly, "that Sheriff Thompson is quite aware of your presence in the territory, Mr. Blackwell, and of your reputation across 3 territories. The telegraph from Kansas City was most informative." Another silence, heavier this time. Eleanor could almost feel Blackwell recalculating his approach. "Interesting that you should mention Kansas City," he finally responded, curiosity evident in his tone. "I spent some time there myself. Fascinating place, particularly the exhibition circuit. Ever attended any of those shooting competitions, Mrs. Reed? The question confirmed Sullivan's suspicions. Blackwell was indeed hunting for more than just valuable horses. He was seeking the legendary shooter mentioned in the marshal's telegram. "Can't say that I have," Eleanor answered, keeping her voice neutral. A disbelieving chuckle came from behind the water trough. "Strange. Because when my associate here visited the telegraph office yesterday, he happened to notice an interesting message from Marshal Jenkins, specifically inquiring about a certain female exhibition shooter." "What was the name, Hank?" "The Golden Whirlwind," replied his companion. "That's right," Blackwell continued. "Apparently quite the sensation a few years back. Set records no one's managed to break since. Then mysteriously disappeared after some unpleasantness with an over-eager challenger." Eleanor remained silent, adjusting her position slightly to keep all three men in her field of awareness. Sundance had awakened in his stall, his restless movements audible as he sensed the tension outside. "Now imagine my surprise," Blackwell went on, his voice taking on a storyteller's cadence, "when I begin inquiring about a widow with an exceptional palomino, only to discover she appeared in Copper Springs 5 years ago, right about the time. The Golden Whirlwind vanished from the circuit. Quite the coincidence, wouldn't you say? The territories are full of widows, Mr. Blackwell, and coincidences." "Indeed they are. But few widows handle frightened horses with the skill you demonstrated yesterday. Fewer still maintain a training ring with professional targets on their property, and I'd wager none have the kind of rifle sight that can place a warning shot exactly 3 feet in front of a man moving at dawn's light." He paused, letting his deductions hang in the air. "You see, Mrs. Reed, or should I say Miss Eleanor Montgomery, I make it my business to know who I'm dealing with." The use of her maiden name, her professional name from the circuit, confirmed what Eleanor had suspected. Blackwell hadn't come merely for Sundance. He'd come seeking the Golden Whirlwind. "If you know who I am," Eleanor replied, her voice steady despite the revelation, "then you know what I'm capable of. 3 men against a professional exhibition shooter aren't favorable odds, Mr. Blackwell." His laugh carried genuine amusement. "Exhibition shooting isn't combat, Mrs. Reed. Hitting stationary targets before a cheering crowd is hardly the same as facing armed men who shoot back. Care to test that theory?" The challenge in Eleanor's voice was subtle but unmistakable. Before Blackwell could respond, the sound of approaching riders interrupted the standoff. From her elevated position, Eleanor could see a group of mounted men emerging from the direction of town. Sheriff Thompson at the lead, flanked by several deputies and townsfolk. "Seems we have company," Eleanor observed. "Perhaps we should continue this discussion another time, Mr. Blackwell." A muttered curse came from behind the water trough. "This isn't over, Golden Whirlwind," Blackwell called, real anger coloring his words. "Not by a long shot. I'd suggest you and your men depart the way you came," Eleanor instructed, keeping her rifle trained on them. "Unless you'd prefer to explain your presence on private property at dawn to Sheriff Thompson." The 3 men exchanged glances, then began a strategic withdrawal toward the tree line, where they'd left their horses. Eleanor maintained her vigilance until they disappeared into the pines, moments before Thompson and his posse arrived in the yard. Descending from the stable loft, Winchester still in hand, Eleanor emerged to greet the lawman. Thompson surveyed the scene with a professional eye, noting her armed state and alert posture. "Trouble, Mrs. Reed?" he inquired, dismounting smoothly. "Nothing I couldn't handle, Sheriff. Mr. Blackwell and 2 of his associates paid an early morning visit. They've just departed through the North Woods." Thompson gestured to 2 of his deputies, who immediately set off in pursuit. "Are you hurt? Did they threaten you?" "I'm fine," Eleanor assured him. Though their intentions were less than honorable, they seemed quite determined to acquire Sundance, by persuasion or force. The sheriff's weathered face hardened with anger. "Doc Sullivan rode out to my place, At first light, said he had a feeling Blackwell might try something. Seems his instincts were correct. Charlie Parker pushed forward from the group of townsfolk, his young face tight with concern. "Mrs. Reed, when Pa heard the doctor talking about trouble out here, he sent me to gather help right away." Eleanor managed a reassuring smile for the boy. "Your timing is excellent, Charlie. Thank you." Thompson approached more closely, lowering his voice. "Mrs. Reed, there's something else you should know. One of Blackwell's men was seen at the telegraph office yesterday, sending messages to several towns. My deputy couldn't see the content, but—" He hesitated, glancing at the rifle she held with such obvious familiarity. "But he suspects they're making inquiries about the Golden Whirlwind," Eleanor finished quietly. Thompson's surprise was evident. "You know about that?" Blackwell made it quite clear during our conversation. "He didn't come just for Sundance, Sheriff. He came looking for me, or rather, for who I used to be." Understanding dawned in Thompson's eyes. "Then the stories about this legendary exhibition shooter can wait for another time," Eleanor interrupted gently. "For now, we should focus on the fact that Blackwell and his men won't give up so easily. Today's confrontation only delays their plans." Thompson nodded, professional concerns taking precedence over curiosity. "The deputies I sent after them won't catch them. They had too much of a head start. But at least we can keep track of their direction." He surveyed her property with a tactical eye. "You shouldn't stay here alone, Mrs. Reed, not with them knowing who you are and what they're after. With respect, Sheriff, I'm safer here than anywhere else in Copper Springs. I know every approach to this property, every line of sight, and, in contrary to Mr. Blackwell's assumptions, exhibition shooting isn't my only skill." The lawman studied her for a long moment, reassessing the quiet widow in light of these revelations. "At least allow me to leave a deputy." "That won't be necessary," Eleanor interrupted firmly. "Your men are needed to protect the town. I can look after myself." As if to emphasize her point, she checked the Winchester's action with practiced efficiency before slinging it over her shoulder. The movement was fluid, natural, revealing years of familiarity with firearms that her widow's garb had previously concealed. Thompson reluctantly conceded with a nod. "At least agree to fire 3 shots if trouble returns. We'll have men stationed within hearing distance around the clock." After the sheriff and his posse departed, Eleanor tended to Sundance, whose agitated state reflected the morning's tension. As she brushed his golden coat with long, soothing strokes, her mind worked through the implications of Blackwell's visit. He hadn't simply recognized her as the Golden Whirlwind, he'd specifically sought her out. The targeting of Sundance wasn't merely opportunistic thievery. It was bait, designed to draw her into the open. The question was why? What could Blackwell possibly gain from confronting a retired exhibition shooter, unless Sullivan's assessment was correct? Unless Blackwell truly was building his reputation through orchestrated confrontations with notable figures, creating situations where he could claim self-defense while eliminating potential rivals to his growing legend. Eleanor completed Sundances, grooming and secured the stable once more, her decision crystallizing as she walked back to the house. If Blackwell wanted to find the Golden Whirlwind, then perhaps it was time to give him exactly what he was looking for, on her terms, not his. Moving to the center of her training ring, Eleanor gazed toward the pine-covered ridge where Blackwell and his men had disappeared. She had no doubt they were watching, probably through a spyglass similar to the one she'd seen Blackwell carrying in town. With deliberate movements, she removed the simple shawl she wore over her work clothes, revealing the distinctive golden-brown suede vest underneath, part of the competition outfit that had been her trademark on the circuit. Then, with fluid grace born of thousands of hours of practice, she drew both revolvers and executed a spinning move that ended with 6 rapid shots, each finding its mark on targets positioned at the far end of the ring. The message was clear. The golden whirlwind wasn't hiding anymore. By midday, news of the morning's confrontation had spread throughout Copper Springs. Eleanor had expected as much. Frontier towns thrived on information, and an armed standoff involving the mysterious widow and the notorious Blackwell gang was too substantial to remain private. What she hadn't anticipated was the response from the townspeople. Samuel Parker arrived first, his wagon loaded with supplies, extra ammunition, preserved food, even materials for reinforcing windows and doors. He declined payment with uncharacteristic firmness. "Consider it the town's investment in our collective security," he explained, while helping unload the provisions. "Way folks see it, you standing up to Blackwell this morning might have saved more than just your horse. Men like that, they don't stop at one success. Every property with anything valuable would have been next." Charlie accompanied his father, his youthful enthusiasm barely contained as he assisted with carrying supplies to the house. The boy's eyes continuously darted to the Winchester rifle Eleanor had propped beside the door, and to the matched revolvers, now openly worn on her gun belt. "Is it true what they're saying, Mrs. Reed?" he finally asked, unable to restrain his curiosity any longer. "That you're really the golden whirlwind from the exhibition circuit?" Eleanor paused in her organization of the supplies, meeting the boy's eager gaze. After years of protecting her privacy, the instinct to deny her past remained strong. But circumstances had changed. Blackwell had ensured that her secret was no longer contained. "Yes, Charlie. Before I came to Copper Springs, I competed under that name." The boy's face lit with undisguised awe. "Pa has old newspaper clippings about you. Said you could shoot a playing card edge-on at 40 paces while riding at full gallop. Said nobody'd ever seen anything like it, man or woman." "Your father exaggerates," Eleanor replied, though a small smile tugged at her lips. "It was 50 paces, and only during perfect conditions." Samuel Parker chuckled at his son's expression. "Told you, boy. Even half the stories about the golden whirlwind are enough to make her the finest shot in 3 territories. More visitors arrived throughout the afternoon. Tom Wilson from the sporting goods store, bringing a specially modified saddle holster he'd been working on. Mary Sullivan, the doctor's wife, delivering a basket of fresh-baked bread and medicinal supplies. Even gruff Harold Bradley from the large ranch to the south, offering to position some of his cowhands as sentries around her property. Eleanor accepted their assistance with quiet gratitude, recognizing in their gestures something more significant than mere neighborly support. In their eyes, she was no longer simply the reclusive widow who kept to herself, but someone who had chosen to protect her adopted community by standing against a common threat. As the sun began its westward descent, Sheriff Thompson returned, accompanied by Doc Sullivan. The lawman's expression was grave as he dismounted in Eleanor's yard. "My deputies tracked Blackwell and his men back to the Holloway place," he reported. "They're all there now, all 7 of them, apparently preparing for something. Lots of activity, checking weapons, moving supplies." "An assault?" Eleanor asked, her tactical mind already assessing possibilities. Thompson shook his head. "Doesn't look that way. More like they're getting ready to move out. The question is where?" He hesitated, exchanging glances with Sullivan. "There's something else. A rider came in from Bakerville this afternoon with news. 3 known gunmen arrived there yesterday, men with reputations as fast draws. Word is they were specifically asked to come to this area. Blackwell's sending for reinforcements," Eleanor concluded, the pattern becoming clear. "He's planning something more elaborate than a simple theft or intimidation." "I think it's worse than that," Sullivan interjected, his medical bag in hand, though his visit clearly had little to do with healthcare. "Based on what we know of Blackwell's past confrontations, he's setting up a public spectacle. A chance to enhance his reputation by facing the golden whirlwind." The implication hung in the air. Blackwell was orchestrating a duel, one that would cement his legend if he emerged victorious over such a renowned shooter. If that's his game, he's made a critical error, Eleanor observed. Exhibition shooting teaches precision under pressure. Speed is secondary to accuracy. Doesn't matter if his plan is to goad you into a street confrontation with witnesses primed to swear you drew first, Thompson pointed out. That's been his method in previous territories, creating situations where his victims appear to be the aggressors. Eleanor's mind worked through the tactical problem. So he needs a public venue, witnesses, a scenario where I can be portrayed as the initiator rather than the defender. Most likely, Sullivan agreed, which means your best strategy is to avoid town entirely. Stay here where you control the environment. Eleanor shook her head slowly. That only delays the inevitable. Blackwell has demonstrated he's willing to come onto my property. Next time, he might arrive with all 7 of his men, plus these additional gunmen from Bakerville. The tactical advantage of familiar territory would be outweighed by sheer numbers. She moved to the map of the territory, tacked to her kitchen wall, studying it with a strategist's eye. No, I need to control when and where this confrontation happens, not just react to Blackwell's orchestration. That's a dangerous game, Thompson warned. These aren't exhibition targets, they're killers. So were many on the circuit, Eleanor replied quietly. You don't travel alone through the territories as a female champion without encountering men who resent your success or covet your prize money. The difference is that I've never sought confrontation, only prepared for it when necessary. Sullivan watched her with concern etched on his features. What are you planning, Eleanor? Instead of answering directly, she turned to Thompson. Sheriff, how quickly could you get word to Marshal Jenkins in Kansas City? Telegraph could reach him by tomorrow evening. Why? Because Blackwell isn't just building a reputation, he's running from one. Eleanor moved to her trunk, withdrawing a carefully preserved newspaper clipping. This article from 5 years ago mentions an investigation into the death of a Texas Ranger near the Kansas border. The Ranger was tracking a gang suspected in a series of high-stakes robberies. He was found shot in the back after allegedly drawing on a traveler claiming to be a horse trader. Thompson's eyes narrowed as he connected the implications. You think Blackwell? I think a man who orchestrates duels to enhance his reputation isn't above eliminating lawmen who get too close to his actual operations, Eleanor finished. And I think Marshal Jenkins would be very interested to know that Jackson Blackwell is currently in Copper Springs, planning his next public self-defense scenario. For the first time since the morning's confrontation, a genuine smile crossed Thompson's weathered face. I'll send that telegram immediately. Might take a few days for Jenkins or his men to arrive, though. Then I'll need to ensure Blackwell remains occupied until they do, Eleanor replied, her resolve evident in her posture. After the sheriff and doctor departed, Eleanor moved methodically through her evening routine, tending to Sundance with particular attention before securing the stable. The Palomino seemed to sense the tension in the air, his normal calm demeanor replaced by heightened alertness. We've been in tight spots before, old friend, she murmured, stroking his golden neck. Remember Santa Fe? Or that situation in Dodge City? We survived those, we'll survive this. But as she returned to the house, checking sight lines and defensive positions with practiced efficiency, Eleanor acknowledged the fundamental difference in this confrontation. In the past, she'd faced men who challenged her skills directly, fair contests, however unwelcome, where her superior ability prevailed. Blackwell operated differently, manufacturing scenarios to ensure his victory, regardless of actual skill or ability. He didn't want a fair test against the Golden Whirlwind. He wanted to eliminate her while enhancing his own legend. That night, as darkness settled over her small ranch, Eleanor made a decision. For 5 years, she had hidden who she truly was, separating the quiet widow from the celebrated exhibition shooter. That division had served its purpose after the tragedy in Kansas City, providing healing space after James's death and the unwanted notoriety that followed. But now, with Blackwell threatening not just Sundance, but potentially the entire community, the time for separation had ended. If the Golden Whirlwind was what Blackwell sought, then the Golden Whirlwind would meet him, not as a reluctant target, but as the precision shooter whose unmatched skills had made her name legendary throughout the territories. Standing before the mirror in her bedroom, Eleanor carefully unpinned her practical braid, letting the honey-brown and silver strands fall loose around her shoulders. From her trunk, she withdrew the final piece of her competition attire, a distinctive hat adorned with a single golden feather, once her trademark on the exhibition circuit. The woman who gazed back from the mirror was neither entirely the reserved widow nor completely the celebrated shooter, but rather a fusion of both, experience and skill, united with purpose and determination. Tomorrow, Eleanor decided, she would ride into Copper Springs, not as someone running from her past, but as someone embracing it fully, someone prepared to use every skill at her disposal to protect what mattered. Dawn broke clear and cold over Copper Springs, the kind of crystalline autumn morning that carried sound for miles across the high country. Eleanor rose before first light, moving through preparations with methodical precision. Each action was purposeful, almost ritualistic, a return to the focused routine she'd followed during her years on the exhibition circuit. The garments she donned were not the practical work clothes of a ranching widow, but the distinctive attire that had once been recognized throughout the Western Territories. The fringed golden-brown suede vest over a crisp white shirt, the split riding skirt that allowed freedom of movement while mounted, the custom boots with specialized holsters. Built into the design, last came the hat with its single golden feather, positioned at a precise angle that shaded her eyes without impeding her vision. In the stable, Sundance seemed to sense the significance of the day. The Palomino stood unusually still as Eleanor fitted him with the competition tack, the specialized saddle designed for both stability and quick maneuvers, the ornate bridle with golden conchos that had been part of their championship image. "One more performance, old friend," she murmured, checking each strap and buckle with particular care, "perhaps our most important one." Charlie Parker arrived as she was leading Sundance from the stable, his young face flushed from riding hard. "Mrs. Reed," he called, sliding from his horse. "Pa sent me to warn you. Blackwell and his men rode into town at first light. They're at Miller's saloon, making quite a show of themselves." Eleanor nodded, unsurprised. "And the gunmen from Bakerville?" "Arrived last night, according to Tom Wilson. They've joined Blackwell at the saloon." Charlie's eyes widened as he took in her transformed appearance. "You're really going into town to face them?" "I am," Eleanor confirmed, checking the matched revolvers one final time before securing them in their holsters. "But not to give Blackwell the confrontation he's orchestrating." "Sheriff Thompson's positioned deputies at strategic points around the town square," Charlie reported. "Said to tell you he sent the telegram to Marshal Jenkins and received confirmation it's been delivered." "Good." Eleanor mounted Sundance with practiced grace, settling into the saddle with the perfect balance that had once made audiences gasp. "In appreciation, I need you to deliver a message to Doc Sullivan, Charlie. Tell him to be ready at his office by noon. Tell him—" She paused, considering her words carefully. "Tell him the Golden Whirlwind has a plan, and to trust that accuracy matters more than speed." Charlie nodded eagerly, clearly thrilled to be part of whatever strategy was unfolding. "Yes, ma'am. Anything. Else just one thing." Eleanor's expression softened slightly. "Thank your father for his support. Whatever happens today, it means a great deal to know the people of Copper Springs stand with me." As Charlie galloped away toward town, Eleanor guided Sundance onto the trail at an unhurried pace. The ride would take approximately 40 minutes. At this speed, timing that factored perfectly into her strategy. She wanted to arrive in Copper Springs at precisely 10 o'clock, when the town would be fully active with morning business. The tactical considerations ran through her mind as Sundance's hooves methodically ate up the distance. Blackwell would expect her to either avoid town entirely or to arrive nervously, perhaps under escort. He wouldn't anticipate her deliberately choosing to make an entrance, particularly not as the Golden Whirlwind in full competition attire. More importantly, he wouldn't expect her to have a strategy beyond defending herself. Men like Blackwell, who manufactured confrontations to appear as self-defense, relied on their victims behaving predictably, reacting rather than acting, responding to provocation rather than seizing initiative. Eleanor had no intention of being predictable. As the trail wound through stands of aspen trees, their leaves gleaming gold in the morning light, she rehearsed each element of her plan. Timing would be crucial, as would the precise execution of movements she had practiced thousands of times during her exhibition career. The difference was that today's performance had stakes far beyond trophies or prize money. From the ridge overlooking Copper Springs, Eleanor paused to survey the town below. Even from this distance, she could sense the unusual tension in the normally placid settlement. The main street appeared busier than typical for a weekday morning, with clusters of townsfolk gathered in small groups, no doubt discussing the notorious visitors who had taken over Miller's saloon. Taking a deep breath, Eleanor adjusted her hat and straightened in the saddle. "Let's remind them who we are," she murmured to Sundance, guiding him forward with the subtle pressure of her knees. Their descent into town was deliberately measured, not a cautious approach, but the confident entry of a performer who understood the value of a proper entrance. Sundance's golden coat gleamed in the morning sun, his stride high and proud as they moved down the center of the main street. Heads turned as they passed, conversations halting mid-sentence as recognition dawned. Many in Copper Springs had only heard stories of the Golden Whirlwind. Now they witnessed the transformation of the quiet widow they'd known for 5 years into the legendary figure whose shooting exhibitions had once drawn crowds from hundreds of miles around. Eleanor acknowledged the townsfolk with slight nods, but maintained her focus, aware of every detail in her surroundings. The positions of Thompson's deputies stationed at key points, the unusual number of horses hitched outside Miller's saloon, the strategic placement of potential cover should the situation deteriorate into violence. She guided Sundance directly to the hitching post in front of the sheriff's office, dismounting with fluid grace before securing him with practiced efficiency. The Palomino's training was evident in his perfect stillness, his alert posture, communicating readiness without anxiety. Sheriff Thompson emerged from his office, his weathered face registering both concern and grudging admiration at her appearance. "Mrs. Reed," he greeted her, deliberately using her widow's name rather than her exhibition title. "Or would you prefer another form of address this morning?" "Eleanor is fine, Sheriff," she replied, her voice carrying just enough to be heard by the growing number of onlookers. "I understand our visitors are making themselves comfortable at Miller's establishment." Thompson nodded, lowering his voice. "Blackwell's got his entire gang in there, plus those 3 gunmen from Bakerville. They've been buying drinks for anyone who'll listen to tales about notorious shootists they've supposedly outdrawn." His expression darkened. "Been making particular mention of a certain exhibition shooter who they claim has been hiding in these parts." "I imagine they have," Eleanor observed calmly, "and I imagine they're hoping word will reach me, drawing me into town for a confrontation of their design." "Which appears to have worked," Thompson noted with concern. A small smile touched Eleanor's lips. "Things aren't always what they appear to be, Sheriff, especially in my former profession." She glanced toward the saloon, where curious faces were already appearing in the windows. I'd like to speak with you privately for a moment, if I may. Inside the sheriff's office, Eleanor quickly outlined her strategy. Thompson listened with increasing interest, his initial skepticism giving way to reluctant admiration as she detailed each element of her approach. It's risky, he cautioned when she finished. A lot depends on perfect timing and reactions you can't entirely predict. Exhibition shooting is primarily about controlling variables others don't even recognize, Eleanor replied, and I spent 10 years mastering that skill. She checked the ornate watch pinned to her vest. It's almost time. Are your deputies positioned as we discussed? Thompson nodded. Exactly as you specified, but Eleanor, he hesitated, genuine, concern evident in his expression. If this goes wrong, then you'll do what needs to be done, she finished firmly. But it won't go wrong, not if everyone plays their part. She adjusted her hat slightly, ensuring the brim was positioned precisely as she preferred for shooting. Remember, Sheriff, when I give the signal, your men must react exactly as we've discussed. No sooner, no later. They understand, Thompson assured her. I just hope you know what you're doing. I've spent my entire adult life preparing for moments that require perfect execution under pressure, Eleanor replied, a hint of the champion emerging in her confident tone. This is simply one more performance, with admittedly higher stakes than a trophy or prize money. As they stepped back onto the boardwalk in front of the sheriff's office, Eleanor could feel the weight of dozens of eyes upon her. Word had clearly spread through town about the transformed widow now standing openly as the Golden Whirlwind. Townsfolk lined the street at a respectful distance, their expressions ranging from curiosity to concern to outright admiration. Across the dusty expanse of the main street, the batwing doors of Miller's saloon swung open. Jackson Blackwell emerged, flanked by his scarred lieutenant and another man Eleanor didn't recognize, presumably one of the Bakerville gunmen. Blackwell paused on the porch, his calculated casual posture belied by the predatory assessment in his gaze as he spotted Eleanor standing beside the sheriff. "Well now," he called, his voice pitched to carry across the street and to the gathered onlookers. "Looks like the rumors are true after all. The legendary Golden Whirlwind, gracing our humble town with her presence." Eleanor met his gaze steadily, her hand resting near but not on her holstered revolver. The positioning was deliberate, alert but not aggressive, ready but not threatening. "Mr. Blackwell," she acknowledged evenly. "I understand you've been asking. About me?" A smile spread across Blackwell's face, the satisfied expression of a predator whose prey had walked willingly into his trap. "Indeed I have, Miss Montgomery. Or do you prefer Mrs. Reed these days? Seems a woman of your talents has collected quite a few names and reputations." The subtle insult hung in the air, the first move in the verbal sparring that traditionally preceded more deadly confrontations in frontier towns. Eleanor recognized the tactic. Blackwell was attempting to provoke her, to create a scenario where her reaction could be interpreted as aggression. But the Golden Whirlwind hadn't survived a decade on the exhibition circuit by succumbing to provocation. The game had begun, and Eleanor was playing for much higher stakes than Blackwell realized. The tension stretched across Copper Springs' main street like a drawn bowstring. Townsfolk, who had started their day with ordinary errands, now found themselves silent witnesses to an extraordinary confrontation. Many had edged toward doorways or alleys, instinctively seeking cover while remaining close enough to observe the unfolding drama. "I've heard stories about the Golden Whirlwind," Blackwell continued, his voice carrying to the gathered crowd. "They say she could outshoot any man on the exhibition circuit, set records nobody's managed to touch since." His tone carried false admiration, a performer playing to his audience. "Quite the accomplishment for a lady." "Records are just numbers, Mr. Blackwell," Eleanor replied evenly. "They don't define what a person is capable of." Blackwell's smile widened as he descended the saloon steps, his movement deliberate as he positioned himself in the center of the street. His men remained on the porch, hands hovering near their weapons, while others watched from the saloon windows, a carefully arranged tableau designed to appear spontaneous to casual observers. "I couldn't agree more," Blackwell responded, spreading his hands in a gesture of apparent reasonableness. "Capabilities are proven in the moment, not in carefully arranged exhibitions or newspaper accounts." His eyes hardened slightly, despite the maintained smile. "I wonder what the Golden Whirlwind is truly capable of when facing something more challenging than stationary targets." Eleanor recognized the escalation for what it was, the next phase in Blackwell's orchestrated confrontation. He was attempting to maneuver her into a public challenge, one where witnesses would later swear she had something to prove against his insinuations. "I've never been one for pointless demonstrations, Mr. Blackwell," she responded, remaining beside the sheriff rather than stepping into the street as Blackwell clearly desired. "My skills were developed for competition, not confrontation." A flash of irritation crossed Blackwell's features before he masked it. Eleanor had refused to follow his script, throwing his careful orchestration slightly off balance. "Yet here you stand," he countered, gesturing toward her distinctive attire, "dressed for a performance rather than a simple trip to town. One might think you came looking for an audience." "I came," Eleanor replied, her voice carrying clearly to all listeners, "because threats were made against my property and my horse, threats by men who crept onto my land before dawn, armed and with clear intent to intimidate or worse." Murmurs rippled through the gathered townsfolk, while many had heard rumors of the confrontation at Eleanor's ranch. Hearing her direct accusation carried significant weight. Sheriff Thompson stepped forward slightly, his hand resting on his holstered revolver. "Mr. Blackwell, these are serious allegations that align with reports from multiple witnesses," Thompson stated officially. "I'd advise you and your men to depart Copper Springs immediately. The Territorial Marshal's office has been informed of your presence and your history in other jurisdictions." Blackwell's expression hardened, the pretense of civility slipping. "Careful, Sheriff. Accusations without proof can be dangerous." His gaze shifted back to Eleanor. "Almost as dangerous as a reputation built on exhibition tricks, rather than real metal." The challenge hung in the air, blatant now in its intent to provoke. Eleanor felt the familiar focus descending, the state of heightened awareness that had served her throughout her competitive career. Every detail registered with crystal clarity, the positions of Blackwell's men, the subtle tension in Thompson's posture, the angle of the morning sun that would affect visibility in a critical moment. "If it's proof you require," Eleanor stated calmly, "perhaps we should examine the telegraph records from the past week. I imagine they'd reveal interesting communications regarding a certain Texas Ranger who was tracking a robbery gang before his unfortunate death 5 years ago." The shot struck home with more precision than any bullet. Blackwell's expression froze, genuine surprise replacing calculated provocation. For a heartbeat, the carefully maintained facade cracked, revealing something darker beneath. "You've been busy with your research, Mrs. Reed," he recovered quickly, though his tone had lost its theatrical quality. "Though I fail to see what ancient history has to do with our current discussion. Marshal Jenkins seems to find it relevant." Eleanor replied, "Relevant enough to dispatch riders from Kansas City who should arrive within the next 2 days." This was a calculated bluff. While the telegram had been sent, she had no confirmation of Jenkins' response beyond basic acknowledgement. Blackwell's eyes narrowed as he reassessed the situation. The gathered crowd had grown larger, with more townsfolk emerging from shops and businesses to witness the confrontation. The public spectacle he'd engineered was unfolding, but not according to his design. "You know," Blackwell said, his voice dropping to a more dangerous register. "I came to Copper Springs with simple business in mind, the acquisition of quality horseflesh, particularly that exceptional palomino of yours. But discovering the golden whirlwind in hiding here," he shook his head in mock disappointment. "It raises questions about what else you might be concealing. What made such a celebrated shooter disappear so completely?" Eleanor maintained her composed expression, despite the threatening undertone. "The reasons are my own, Mr. Blackwell, just as your reasons for orchestrating confrontations with noted shootists across the territories are yours." Another ripple of murmurs passed through the crowd. Blackwell's reputation had clearly preceded him, though perhaps not in the manner he preferred. "I see Sheriff Thompson has been sharing gossip as well as telegrams," Blackwell remarked, his hand drifting closer to his holstered revolver. "Shouldn't believe everything you hear, Mrs. Reed. Some men earn their reputations through skill rather than stagecraft." "Indeed they do," Eleanor agreed, her stance shifting subtly. The movement was minimal but significant to those trained to recognize it, the balanced preparation of a professional preparing for action. Others manufacture confrontations where witnesses conveniently report self-defense against opponents who suspiciously draw first. The directness of the accusation caused several of Blackwell's men to tense visibly. On the saloon porch, the scarred lieutenant's hand dropped to his gun, his weight shifting forward. Sheriff Thompson raised his voice to address the gathering crowd. "Folks, I'm asking everyone to clear the street. This is official business now." Most townsfolk retreated further from the potential line of fire, though none abandoned their observation posts entirely. The confrontation had evolved beyond mere entertainment into something profoundly consequential for their community. Blackwell regarded Eleanor with a new calculation, reassessing the widow who had transformed into something far more formidable than his initial target. "You're playing a dangerous game, Golden Whirlwind." "I'm not playing any game, Mr. Blackwell," Eleanor replied. "I'm simply standing my ground against men who threatened what's mine." The standoff had reached its critical juncture, the moment where Blackwell would either escalate to open confrontation or withdraw to reconsider his approach. Eleanor could read the calculation in his eyes, the weighing of options against potential outcomes. "Perhaps we've all been too hasty," Blackwell finally said, affecting a more conciliatory tone while signaling subtly to his men. "Simple misunderstandings. It can escalate unnecessarily in these situations. As a gesture of goodwill, my associates and I will withdraw to consider your perspective on recent events." The strategic retreat was unexpected but not unwelcome. Eleanor maintained her vigilance, recognizing that Blackwell was simply regrouping rather than surrendering. "A wise decision," Sheriff Thompson affirmed, though his posture remained alert. "I'll expect your entire group to depart from Copper Springs by sundown." Blackwell's smile returned, though it carried none of its former confidence. "Sundown may be ambitious, Sheriff. We have preparations to make, supplies to gather." His gaze locked on Eleanor once more. "But rest assured, our business here will conclude very soon." The threat beneath the civil words was unmistakable. As Blackwell backed toward the saloon, maintaining careful distance and awareness of all present, Eleanor recognized the tactical retreat for what it was. Not capitulation, but repositioning. When Blackwell and his lieutenant had rejoined their companions at the saloon entrance, the gang leader turned back toward Eleanor with a final parting comment. "You know, Golden Whirlwind, that magnificent palomino of yours truly is a remarkable animal. Be a shame if anything happened to him while you're busy protecting your reputation in town." The implication struck Eleanor with physical force. While she had prepared for a direct confrontation, Blackwell had identified her true vulnerability. Sundance remained hitched outside the sheriff's office, technically protected, but still potentially accessible. "I've stationed men at your ranch," Thompson murmured, reading her concern. "But if he's shifting tactics—" "He is," Eleanor confirmed quietly. "The confrontation here was just a diversion. He wanted to draw me into town, away from my property, as—" Blackwell disappeared into the saloon with his men. The tension in the street diminished, but didn't dissipate. Townsfolk began speaking in hushed tones, processing what they'd witnessed while maintaining wary eyes on the saloon. Eleanor turned to Thompson, her voice low but urgent. "Sheriff, I need to return to my ranch immediately. Blackwell won't risk a direct confrontation now that his reputation has been publicly questioned, and the territorial marshal alerted. He'll strike at what he perceives as my weakness." Thompson nodded grimly. "I'll send deputies with you." "No," Eleanor countered. "Keep them here watching Blackwell and his men. That group in the saloon may be another diversion. I suspect some of his men are already on their way to my property." She glanced toward the gathering clouds on the western horizon. "A storm's coming. It will cover their movements and muffle sounds of approach." As she moved toward Sundance, checking his tack with swift efficiency, Eleanor knew with certainty that the real confrontation still lay ahead. Blackwell had revealed his hand. Not a public duel with the Golden Whirlwind, but a strike at the heart of what she valued most. The game had changed, but Eleanor Reed had spent a lifetime adapting to changing conditions in the heat of competition. If Blackwell thought targeting Sundance would provide an easy victory, he was about to discover just how formidable the Golden Whirlwind could be when protecting what she loved. Eleanor rode hard toward her ranch, Sundance's powerful strides eating up the distance as storm clouds gathered overhead. The Palomino seemed to sense the urgency, responding to her subtle cues with the instant precision that had made them championship partners. While most horses would have tired from such a pace, Sundance maintained his fluid gait, a testament to his exceptional breeding and conditioning. The first fat raindrops began to fall as they created the final ridge overlooking her property. Eleanor reined Sundance to a halt, studying the landscape below with tactical scrutiny. Nothing appeared immediately amiss. The house and stable stood undisturbed in the afternoon light, the training ring empty, no horses visible that didn't belong. Yet her instincts, honed through years of traveling dangerous territories alone, screamed warning. The property's apparent tranquility felt staged rather than natural. "They're here," she murmured to Sundance, whose ears flicked back at her voice. "Question is, where?" Rather than taking the direct trail down to her ranch, Eleanor guided Sundance into the dense stand of aspens that flanked the eastern approach. The golden leaves provided partial concealment as she circled wide, using the terrain to mask their approach while maintaining visual contact with her property. Through the trees, she caught a flash of movement near her stable. A man crouching beside the water trough, rifle in hand. Another shadow shifted at the corner of her house. Blackwell had indeed split his forces, leaving some men in town as a diversion while sending others ahead to ambush her at the ranch. Eleanor dismounted, in a protected hollow, securing Sundance with a precision born of thousands of practices. "Stay," she commanded softly, using the specific tone that the Palomino had been trained to obey absolutely. The horse remained perfectly still, barely even flicking his tail despite the increasing rainfall. Moving silently through the underbrush, Eleanor worked her way closer to her property, using the intensifying storm as cover. The rain muffled sound while reducing visibility, conditions that would disadvantage those unfamiliar with the terrain, but that she could navigate with practiced ease. From her new vantage point, she could identify 3 men positioned around her property, one by the stable, one near the house, and a third partially concealed behind the woodpile at the property's edge. Their positions created interlocking fields of fire that would catch anyone approaching directly from the main trail. Had she ridden in normally, she would have been caught in a deadly crossfire before even realizing the danger. Eleanor withdrew the Winchester from its scabbard, using its scope to study each man more carefully. The one by the stable was the scarred lieutenant she'd encountered during their first confrontation. Near the house waited one of the Bakerville gunmen, his distinctive red shirt visible despite his attempts at concealment. The third man was unfamiliar, likely another of Blackwell's gang members. But where was Blackwell himself? The answer came as the stable door creaked open and Jackson Blackwell emerged leading a fourth man. Even at this distance, Eleanor could read the frustration in Blackwell's posture as he gestured toward the empty stalls, clearly displeased at finding Sundance absent. Eleanor's jaw tightened as she realized the full scope of Blackwell's plan. He hadn't just intended to steal Sundance. He had set an elaborate trap, using the horse as bait to lure her into a deadly ambush upon her return. The confrontation in town had been merely the opening gambit, designed to ensure she would race home, concerned for her prized Palomino, directly into their waiting guns. The rain intensified, sheets of water obscuring visibility beyond 50 yards, perfect conditions for what she needed to do. Moving back to where Sundance waited, Eleanor quickly made her preparations. From her saddlebags, she extracted several items that would have seemed peculiar to casual observers: a small mirror, a leather pouch of specialized ammunition, and a curious mechanical device that resembled a miniature windmill. Exhibition shooting had taught Eleanor that perception could be manipulated, that audiences could be directed to focus on flash while missing substance. The same principles applied to combat, particularly when outnumbered. With swift efficiency, she loaded her Winchester with the specialized rounds, ammunition handcrafted for pinpoint accuracy rather than maximum damage. Then, securing the rifle across her back, she drew her matched revolvers, checking each chamber with practiced movements before returning them to their holsters. The storm's intensity provided natural cover as Eleanor circled to approach her property. From the blind spot behind the stable, the winds had picked up, driving the rain in sheets that further reduced visibility. Lightning flashed in the distance, followed seconds later by rumbling thunder that would mask any sounds of approach. Eleanor paused at the edge of the clearing, calculating angles and positions one final time. 4 against 1 were poor odds in conventional terms, but the Golden Whirlwind had never operated by conventional standards. Her strength had always been precision under pressure, the ability to execute perfect shots in imperfect conditions. Removing the small mechanical device from her pocket, Eleanor placed it carefully at the base of a pine tree, adjusting its settings before activating the spring-loaded mechanism. Then, moving with silent efficiency, she positioned the mirror on a branch angled to catch the next lightning flash. When the brilliant fork of electricity split the sky, the mirror reflected its light directly toward the stables, a momentary flash that would register as movement to watchful eyes. Simultaneously, the mechanical device began emitting a rhythmic clicking sound, barely audible above the storm, but distinctive enough to draw attention. The diversion worked as intended. The man behind the woodpile raised his rifle, focusing toward the disturbance. Eleanor moved in the opposite direction, using the moment of distraction to cross 20 yards of open ground to the back of her house. Entering through the rear door she'd deliberately left unlocked that morning, Eleanor moved through the familiar interior with practiced silence. She knew every board that might creak, every shadow that could conceal or expose. Through the front window, she could see the Bakerville gunman still watching the yard, rain dripping from his hat brim as he scanned for movement. Eleanor positioned herself carefully, using the angle of the window to minimize her exposure while maximizing her field of fire. The first of her matched revolvers cleared its holster with fluid precision, her finger finding the trigger with the muscle memory born of thousands of hours of practice. The shot cracked through the storm's background noise, not aimed at the man himself, but at his weapon. The specialized round struck the rifle's barrel with pinpoint accuracy, the impact sending the weapon spinning from his grasp as he cried out in surprised pain, his hands reflexively clutching his numbed fingers. Before the others could identify the source of the shot, Eleanor was already moving to her next position. The mechanical device she'd planted activated its secondary function, creating a series of small popping sounds that mimicked gunfire from the opposite direction. The confusion was immediate, Blackwell and his men diving for cover, uncertain where the attack originated. Eleanor used their momentary disorientation to her advantage, moving to the side window that overlooked the stable yard. The scarred lieutenant had taken cover behind the water trough, his rifle aimed toward the source of the mechanical noises. Rather than the house, her second shot struck with equal precision, not to kill, but to disarm. The bullet impacted the rifle's wooden stock, splintering it and rendering the weapon useless, without harming the man beyond superficial splinters. 2 down, 2 to go. Blackwell's voice cut through the storm, shouting orders to regroup. Eleanor caught movement as the fourth man broke cover, running toward the stable where Blackwell had taken position. The angle was difficult, the distance challenging, especially through rain-streaked glass, but the Golden Whirlwind hadn't earned her reputation through easy shots. The third bullet caught the running man's gunbelt buckle with such precision that the impact spun him halfway around, the leather breaking as his holstered revolver fell uselessly into the mud. Before he could recover, Eleanor fired again, the fourth shot striking his boot heel and sending him sprawling face first into the sodden ground. In less than 15 seconds, she had effectively neutralized 3 armed men without causing life-threatening injury to any, a display of marksmanship that would have seemed impossible to anyone who hadn't witnessed the Golden Whirlwind in her prime. Only Blackwell remained, now securely positioned inside the stable with limited angles of exposure. Eleanor knew he wouldn't be drawn out easily, nor would he be caught by the same tactics that had worked on his men. He was the most dangerous of the 4, not necessarily because of superior skill, but because desperation would make him unpredictable. What Blackwell couldn't know was that Eleanor had prepared for this confrontation long before he'd arrived in Copper Springs. The stable might seem like a defensive position to him, but to her it was simply another performance venue, one where every board, beam, and shadow was as familiar as the feel of a revolver in her hand. The storm continued to rage around them, nature's dramatic backdrop to the final act of a confrontation that had been building since Jackson Blackwell first set eyes on Sundance, and the quiet widow who was far more than she appeared. Lightning fractured the sky, momentarily illuminating the rain-soaked landscape with harsh brilliance. In that flash of clarity, Eleanor assessed the situation with professional detachment. Blackwell's 3 associates were effectively neutralized, the first nursing a numbed hand and searching fruitlessly for his displaced weapon, the second examining his shattered rifle with bewildered anger, the third still struggling to rise from the mud after his unexpected fall. None were seriously injured, but all were disarmed and disoriented, precisely as she had intended. The Golden Whirlwind had built her reputation on disabling opponents without killing them, a philosophy that had set her apart from other exhibition shooters who prioritized flash over substance. Only Blackwell himself remained a threat, now barricaded. Inside her stable, Eleanor knew the structure intimately, its strengths, its vulnerabilities, the positioning of every stall and storage area. What appeared to be a defensible position to Blackwell was, in reality, a carefully maintained environment that Eleanor had designed with security in mind. "Blackwell!" she called, her voice carrying over the storm's rumble. "Your men are disarmed. The sheriff and his deputies are on their way. There's no scenario where this ends in your favor." Silence answered her, broken only by the steady drumming of rain on the roof and the occasional distant thunder. Eleanor hadn't expected surrender. Men like Blackwell didn't yield easily, particularly when their carefully constructed reputation was at stake. She moved to a different window, maintaining unpredictability in her positioning. Through the rain-streaked glass, she could see Blackwell's lieutenant finally abandoning his useless rifle and helping the third man to his feet. The Bakerville gunman had given up searching for his weapon in the increasingly muddy yard, instead taking shelter beneath the overhang of the woodshed. "You've got quite the aim, Golden Whirlwind," Blackwell's voice finally responded from within the stable. "Though shooting guns from hands is a lot different than facing a man directly. We both know direct confrontation was never your intention." "Mr. Blackwell," Eleanor replied, shifting position again, "you arranged an ambush, not a duel. 4 men against 1 woman hardly suggests confidence in your abilities." Another silence, heavier this time. Eleanor used the moment to move swiftly through the house to the kitchen, where a small window offered a different angle on the stable's side entrance, a potential escape route Blackwell might consider. "What I find most interesting," she continued, ensuring her voice projected clearly despite her changed position, "is how your reputation seems built entirely on confrontations where witnesses conveniently report your opponents drew first. Yet when faced with a skilled shooter under conditions you don't control, your preference is for ambush rather than fair contest." "Fair?" Blackwell's laugh carried a bitter edge. "Nothing's fair in this world, Golden Whirlwind. I learned that lesson watching better men than me die because they believed in fairness." His voice hardened. "You've got skills, I'll grant you that. But skills don't matter when the deck is stacked against you." Eleanor recognized the shift in his tone, the calculated performer giving way to something more authentic, more dangerous. "Is that what happened with the Texas Ranger? Was the deck stacked against him when he was shot in the back?" The question hung in the storm-charged air. Eleanor moved again, this time to the small mudroom where her rain slicker hung beside the door. She donned it smoothly, preparing for what would come next. "You don't know what you're talking about," Blackwell finally responded, though something in his voice had changed, a defensiveness that hadn't been present before. "Marshal Jenkins seems to think otherwise," Eleanor countered. "His telegram mentioned specific evidence connecting you to the Ranger's death, evidence that never made it to court because witnesses mysteriously disappeared or changed their statements." This was another calculated bluff, building on her earlier mention of Jenkins to rattle Blackwell's composure. While the Marshal had indeed been investigating the Ranger's death, Eleanor had no knowledge of specific evidence beyond what Sullivan had shared from old newspaper accounts. "Jenkins has been chasing ghosts for years," Blackwell dismissed, though his response came too quickly, too forcefully. "Man's obsessed with pinning something on me because he can't accept that his precious Ranger friend drew on the wrong person." Eleanor noted the personal animosity in his voice, a connection between Blackwell and Jenkins that went deeper than professional rivalry. She filed the information away, another piece in the psychological puzzle she was assembling. "Seems we're at an impasse," she observed, moving to the front door and positioning herself carefully beside it. "You can't leave the stable without exposing yourself to my aim. Your men are disarmed and of no help, and reinforcements are on their way from town." "You think you've won," Blackwell replied, his voice taking on a dangerous edge. "But you've forgotten something important, Golden Whirlwind. And what might that be?" "That magnificent palomino of yours," Blackwell answered, satisfaction evident even through the storm's background noise. "The one thing you truly care about. Where do you think he is right now?" Eleanor's heart stuttered momentarily before she forced herself to remain calm. Sundance was safely hidden in the aspen grove where she'd left him, trained to remain in place until she gave the specific command or whistle to release him. "If you're suggesting you have men holding Sundance somewhere," she replied steadily, "I find that difficult to believe. Your entire gang is accounted for. 3 disarmed men in my yard, and you in my stable." "Not my entire gang," Blackwell corrected, confidence returning to his voice. "Did you really think I'd bring everyone to town where the sheriff could keep track of them? I left 2 of my best men watching the trails while we were putting on our little show in Copper Springs. Men who know horses, who could track that Palomino of yours, no matter where you might have hidden him." The claim was plausible enough to send a chill through Eleanor, despite her certainty that Sundance remained safely concealed. Blackwell was attempting to manipulate her emotional connection to the horse, to create doubt, to force her into a rash move. "A convincing bluff, Mr. Blackwell," she replied, keeping her voice level. "But that's all it is. Sundance is beyond your reach." "Are you willing to bet his life on that certainty?" Blackwell challenged. "Because my men have instructions. If they don't hear from me by sundown, your precious champion will be worth nothing but glue." Eleanor weighed her options carefully. The storm was beginning to slacken, the heaviest bands of rain moving eastward. Soon, visibility would improve, potentially changing the tactical situation. She needed to resolve this confrontation quickly before Blackwell could regroup or his supposed men elsewhere could become a factor, whether they actually had Sundance or not. With swift decision, Eleanor slipped through the front door onto the covered porch, using the corner post as partial cover while maintaining a clear line of sight to the stable entrance. The 3 disarmed men watched her emergence with wary attention, but made no aggressive movements. The demonstration of her shooting skills had clearly left an impression. "Mr. Blackwell," she called, rainwater running from the brim of her distinctive. "And I'm giving you one final opportunity to surrender peacefully. Walk out with your hands clearly visible, and you'll face due process rather than potentially deadly force." "Due process?" Blackwell's laugh held genuine amusement. "You mean a rigged territorial court where Jenkins has half the judges in his pocket? I think I'll take my chances here." Eleanor had expected this response. Men like Blackwell rarely surrendered when alternatives existed, no matter how desperate those alternatives might be. "Then I'll be forced to enter the stable and remove you myself," she stated with calm certainty. "You'd be walking into a killing box," Blackwell countered. "I've got clear sight lines to both entrances. The first step through either door would be your last." "Perhaps," Eleanor acknowledged, "if I used the doors." Without further warning, she raised her Winchester and fired 3 precise shots in rapid succession. The bullets struck the stable roof in a specific pattern, not to penetrate, but to activate the mechanism Eleanor had installed years earlier as a fire safety measure. The specialized roofing panel, designed to open quickly for ventilation during summer heat, swung upward on its hinges, creating an opening approximately 3 feet square. Blackwell's startled curse was audible even through the diminishing storm noise. Eleanor immediately fired again, this time targeting the oil lamp hanging from a beam inside the stable. The bullet shattered the glass chimney without igniting the oil, plunging the interior into relative darkness while showering glass onto the floor below, creating both disorientation and a treacherous surface for anyone attempting to move quickly. The tactical advantage had shifted dramatically. Eleanor now had access to an entrance Blackwell hadn't anticipated, combined with superior knowledge of the interior layout and better adjusted vision. "Last chance, Blackwell," she called. "Surrender, now, or I'll be forced to demonstrate that the Golden Whirlwind's reputation was built on more than exhibition tricks." "Come and get me," Blackwell snarled, abandoning the pretense entirely. "Let's see if you're as good with moving targets as you are with stationary ones." Eleanor had expected this reaction. Pride sometimes overrode survival instincts, particularly in men accustomed to dominating through intimidation rather than skill. She whistled sharply, a specific three-note pattern that carried across the rain-soaked landscape toward the aspen grove where she'd left Sundance. The response was immediate. The magnificent Palomino emerged from the trees at full gallop, his golden coat gleaming despite the overcast conditions as he thundered toward the yard. The sight of the charging horse momentarily transfixed everyone, including Blackwell, whose face appeared briefly at one of the stable windows. That momentary distraction was all Eleanor needed. With fluid grace born of thousands of practice sessions, she vaulted from the porch railing onto Sundance's back as he passed, the pair moving in perfect synchronization, born of years as championship partners. Without breaking stride, the Palomino circled toward the stable, positioning Eleanor for what would be her most challenging shot yet. As horse and rider swept past the stable's open side window, Eleanor fired twice in rapid succession. The first bullet struck the revolver in Blackwell's hand with pinpoint precision, spinning the weapon away before he could squeeze the trigger. The second shot caught his hat brim, removing it cleanly without harming him, a demonstration of control and accuracy that left no doubt about who truly held the superior skill. Blackwell stumbled backward in shock, his carefully constructed facade of deadly competence shattered in an instant. The legendary Golden Whirlwind had just performed in combat conditions, a feat of marksmanship that most exhibition shooters couldn't accomplish on a practice range with stationary targets. Sundance completed his circle, coming to a perfect sliding. "Stop that," positioned Eleanor directly before the stable's main entrance, both revolvers now drawn and aimed steadily. "It's over, Blackwell," she stated with quiet finality. "You've lost." Inside the stable, Jackson Blackwell stood frozen in disbelief, his empty hand still raised where his revolver had been moments before. The weapon lay several feet away, knocked clean from his grasp by a shot that defied conventional marksmanship. His hat had similarly vanished, the second bullet having removed it with surgical precision without grazing a single hair on his head. "That's not possible," he muttered, genuine awe momentarily displacing his anger. "Nobody makes shots like that from a moving horse." "The Golden Whirlwind does," Eleanor replied simply, both revolvers trained steadily on him through the stable entrance. Sundance remained perfectly positioned beneath her, responding to subtle knee pressure that kept him aligned for optimal shooting angles. "Now, step out slowly with your hands where I can see them." For a moment, rebellion flickered across Blackwell's features, the instinctive resistance of a man unaccustomed to defeat. His eyes darted around the stable interior, seeking any advantage or escape route. Finding none, his shoulders finally slumped in resignation. "Seems those exhibition records weren't exaggerated after all," he acknowledged, moving cautiously toward the entrance, with hands raised. "Should have done more research before coming after you." "Research wouldn't have helped," Eleanor observed, maintaining her vigilance as he emerged into the diminishing rainfall. "Your fundamental error wasn't underestimating my skills. It was assuming that threatening what someone values gives you power over them. Sometimes it just gives them clarity." Blackwell's three associates watched with stunned expressions as their leader was marched at gunpoint to join them in the muddy yard. The scarred lieutenant seemed particularly shocked, his weathered face registering disbelief at the complete reversal of their fortunes. "You could have killed us all," he observed, studying Eleanor with newfound respect. "Those shots, they were deliberate, disabling without deadly force." Eleanor nodded slightly, acknowledging the assessment without lowering her guard. "Killing is rarely necessary when you have sufficient skill. Something your employer might have learned if he'd built his reputation on ability rather than intimidation." The sound of approaching riders drew everyone's attention to the trail leading from town. Sheriff Thompson appeared at the head of a small posse, their horses pushing through the lingering mist that followed the storm. Thompson reined in sharply, taking in the scene with professional assessment, 4 disarmed men standing in the muddy yard. Eleanor mounted on Sundance with revolvers drawn, and clear evidence of precisely placed shots visible on various surfaces. "Mrs. Reed," Thompson called as he dismounted, hand resting cautiously on his own weapon. "I see you've handled things without our assistance." "The situation is contained, Sheriff," Eleanor confirmed, finally holstering one revolver while keeping the other trained on Blackwell. Mr. Blackwell and his associates attempted an ambush, but found themselves outmatched. Thompson gestured to his deputies, who moved forward to secure the 4 men. As handcuffs were applied, the sheriff approached Eleanor, his expression a mixture of admiration and concern. "When we heard shots, we feared the worst," he admitted quietly. "Didn't expect to find you holding all 4 at gunpoint without a scratch on you." The sheriff shook his head in wonder. "In all my years wearing this badge, I've never seen marksmanship like what's evident here." He gestured toward the water trough with its precisely shattered rifle, the bullet-split gun belt lying in the mud, and the strategically placed shots in the stable roof. "You could have killed them all with that kind of accuracy." "That was never my intention," Eleanor replied, dismounting with fluid grace and running an appreciative hand along Sundance's neck. "Even during my exhibition years, I never saw firearms as instruments of death, only as tools requiring respect and precision." As the deputies began leading the prisoners toward the horses, Blackwell turned back toward Eleanor, his expression enigmatic. "You've won this round, Golden Whirlwind, but this isn't over, not by a long shot." Thompson stepped forward, his hand dropping to his revolver. "Actually, Blackwell, it is over. We received another telegram while riding out here. Marshal Jenkins is arriving on tomorrow's train with specific warrants for your arrest. Seems that the matter of the Texas Ranger wasn't as cold as you thought." The color drained from Blackwell's face, his practiced confidence crumbling visibly. "Jenkins can't prove anything. It's been 5 years. Witnesses disappear. Memories fade." "Not all witnesses," Eleanor countered quietly. "And some memories remain crystal clear, especially when they involve watching a friend murdered from an ambush." Understanding dawned in Thompson's eyes as he studied Eleanor with new insight. "You were there," he realized, "when the Ranger was killed. You witnessed it." Eleanor nodded, the admission releasing a burden she'd carried for years. "James and I were traveling the exhibition circuit, camped outside the town where it happened. The Ranger had stopped to warn us about a dangerous gang operating in the area. He was tracking them after a bank robbery that left 2 tellers dead." She stroked Sundance's neck, drawing comfort from the familiar connection as painful memories resurfaced. "Later that night, we heard shots. James insisted on investigating. He'd been a deputy before we married, still carried that sense of duty. We arrived in time to see Blackwell standing over the Ranger's body, claiming self-defense to the gathering townsfolk." Blackwell's expression hardened, recognition flaring in his eyes. "The couple with the wagon and the fancy palomino, you were at the edge of the crowd. I remember now. We knew what we'd seen," Eleanor continued, meeting his gaze steadily. "The Ranger was shot in the back. Not in a face-to-face confrontation, as Blackwell claimed. James insisted on testifying, on bringing the truth to light." Understanding spread across Thompson's weathered features. "That's why you disappeared from the circuit, not just because of what happened in Kansas City, but because you were hiding from Blackwell and his gang." Eleanor nodded, relief evident in her features as a secret kept for 5 years finally emerged. 2 days before the hearing, James fell ill suddenly. The local doctor couldn't explain it, a healthy man declining so rapidly. By the time Marshal Jenkins had a specialist examine him, it was too late. "Poison," Thompson concluded grimly. "With your husband gone, your testimony alone wouldn't have been enough against Blackwell's manufactured witnesses." Jenkins suspected as much, but couldn't prove it, Eleanor confirmed. He advised me to disappear, to create a new identity until he could build a stronger case. Her gaze hardened as she looked at Blackwell. The exhibition incident in Kansas City provided the perfect opportunity. Everyone assumed the Golden Whirlwind had retired after that public confrontation. No one looked for Eleanor Montgomery in a widow named Reed running a small ranch in Copper Springs. Blackwell's face contorted with angry realization. All this time I've been hunting a witness against me without even knowing it. If I'd recognized you at the beginning, you would have tried to silence me as you did James, Eleanor finished calmly. Instead, you became so focused on my reputation as the Golden Whirlwind and on acquiring Sundance that you never looked deeper into why I might be living under a different name. Thompson signaled to his deputies to resume moving the prisoners toward the waiting horses. Marshal Jenkins will be very interested in this new information. I imagine his case against you just got considerably stronger, Blackwell. As the group prepared to depart, Eleanor approached Blackwell one final time. You were right about one thing, she told him quietly. Skills don't matter when the deck is stacked against you. James discovered that when he tried to stand against you alone. The difference is that I'm not alone. I have an entire community standing with me and a marshal who never stopped seeking justice. The defeat in Blackwell's eyes was complete. The calculated facade entirely stripped away, revealing the coward who had built a reputation through intimidation rather than genuine ability. As the deputies led him toward the waiting horses, his shoulders slumped with the recognition that his carefully constructed legend had collapsed entirely. Sheriff Thompson lingered as his men secured the prisoners. You've been carrying that burden for 5 years, he observed gently, hiding who you are, what you witnessed, why you really came to Copper Springs. It seemed the only way to stay alive long enough for justice to find its course, Eleanor replied, gazing toward the distant mountains where the storm clouds were breaking, allowing shafts of late afternoon sunlight to pierce through. James believed in doing what was right, even when it carried terrible risk. In the end, I couldn't dishonor his memory by doing any less. The posse departed with their prisoners as the sun emerged fully from behind the dissipating clouds, bathing the rain-washed landscape in golden light. Eleanor stood in her yard watching them disappear down the trail, Sundance's solid presence beside her, providing the same steadfast support he had offered through years of competition and 5 years of hiding. Doc Sullivan arrived shortly after. The posse's departure, medical bag in hand, having followed at a more measured pace once word reached town that the confrontation had ended. Not a single serious injury, he marveled, after examining the scene and hearing Eleanor's account. 4 armed men were neutralized through precision shooting rather than bloodshed. The stories about the Golden Whirlwind's accuracy weren't exaggerated after all. If anything, they understated it, Eleanor replied with a small smile, the first genuine one she'd allowed herself since the ordeal began. Exhibition shooting develops a different kind of precision than most gunmen ever achieve. The goal was never speed alone. It was control, accuracy under the most challenging conditions. Sullivan studied her with professional concern, noting the subtle signs of emotional and physical fatigue beginning to show beneath her composed exterior. What happens now, Eleanor? With your identity revealed, with the truth about why you came to Copper Springs now in the open? The question hung in the air between them, a crossroads reached after 5 years of careful anonymity. Eleanor gazed around her small ranch, taking in the weathered buildings that had become home, the training ring where she had quietly maintained her skills, and finally to Sundance, whose presence had been both comfort and connection to her true self throughout the years of hiding. Now, she said finally, I stop running, stop hiding who I am and what I can do. Her voice gained strength as she continued. James always said my abilities were a gift meant to be shared, not hidden away. Perhaps it's time I honored that belief. As the last rays of sunlight gilded Sundance's coat to a deep gold, Eleanor, Reed, once again embracing her identity as the golden whirlwind, faced the future with renewed clarity. The burden of secrecy had been lifted, replaced by the freedom that comes with living truth undisguised. 6 months passed, bringing spring's renewal to Copper Springs. The town had changed subtly but significantly since the confrontation with the Blackwell Gang, a community transformed not just by the events themselves, but by the revelations that followed. Eleanor stood in her training ring, watching as a dozen students of varying ages practiced the fundamentals of marksmanship. Nearby, Charlie Parker demonstrated proper stance to young Lily Thompson, the sheriff's daughter, having become one of Eleanor's most dedicated apprentices. Tom Wilson worked with a group of older men at the far end, focusing on practical accuracy rather than speed. Remember, Eleanor called to the assembled students, precision matters more than rapid fire. A single well-placed shot accomplishes more than a dozen hasty ones. The training program had begun modestly, just a few curious townsfolk requesting instruction after witnessing Eleanor's extraordinary skills during the Blackwell confrontation. Word spread quickly, however, drawing participants from neighboring settlements until the Saturday sessions had become a regional attraction. "Mrs. Montgomery!" young Tommy Weber called, using the professional name Eleanor had reclaimed. "Did you really shoot a silver dollar out of the air at 50 paces during the Denver exhibition?" Eleanor smiled, the expression coming more easily these days. "It was 40 paces, Tommy, and it took years of practice before I could accomplish it consistently. Will you show us?" Several voices chorused eagerly. "Perhaps at the end of today's session," Eleanor promised, "if everyone completes their fundamental drills first." The students returned to their practice with renewed enthusiasm. Eleanor moved among them, making small corrections to grip or stance, offering encouragement where needed and gentle redirection where necessary. The teaching role suited her, allowed her to share the skills she'd developed over decades, while emphasizing responsible firearms handling and ethical application. Sundance watched from a nearby paddock, his golden coat gleaming in the spring sunshine. The Palomino had become something of a local celebrity in his own right, with children often bringing him apples or carrots when visiting the ranch. Marshal Jenkins arrived as the noon break approached, his tall figure unmistakable as he rode up the trail from town. Eleanor had been expecting him. His telegrams over the past week had indicated this visit was coming, though the exact purpose remained unspecified. "Quite the operation you've developed here," Jenkins observed after dismounting, watching as the students broke into smaller groups for lunch. The marshal had aged since Eleanor had last seen him 5 years earlier, more silver in his hair, deeper lines around his eyes, but he carried himself with the same steady authority. "It grew naturally from the community's needs," Eleanor replied, guiding him toward the house where lunch awaited. "After everything that happened with Blackwell, people wanted to learn how to protect themselves properly." Inside, Eleanor poured coffee while Jenkins settled at her kitchen table. They had collaborated extensively during the months following Blackwell's arrest, with Eleanor providing detailed testimony about both the Ranger's murder and her suspicions regarding James's poisoning. "The territorial court has reached its decision," Jenkins announced without preamble, accepting the offered cup. "Blackwell has been sentenced to hang for the murder of Ranger Davis. His lieutenant received 20 years for complicity, while the others drew shorter sentences for their various crimes." Eleanor absorbed this news with quiet gravity. "And the matter of James's death?" Jenkins' expression softened with regret. "The evidence remains circumstantial. While the court acknowledged The suspicious timing and circumstances, they couldn't establish definitive proof of poisoning after so many years. He reached across the table, briefly covering her hand with his own. "I'm sorry, Eleanor. I know it's not the complete justice you deserved." "James would understand," she replied after a moment. "He believed in the system, even with its imperfections. The important thing is that Blackwell can never harm anyone else." They ate lunch discussing lighter matters: the upcoming territorial shooting competition, the improvements to Copper Springs that had followed the recent expansion of the railway line, Jenkins' plans for retirement at the end of the year. "That actually relates to why I'm here," Jenkins said as they finished their meal. "I have a proposal to discuss with you." Eleanor raised an eyebrow, intrigued by his suddenly formal tone. "The territorial governor has authorized the establishment of a formal firearms training program for law enforcement officers," Jenkins explained. "Too many deputies and marshals rely on speed rather than accuracy, with predictably dangerous results for bystanders and themselves." "A worthwhile initiative," Eleanor agreed, seeing where this might be heading. "The governor specifically requested you as the lead instructor," Jenkins confirmed. "Your reputation as the Golden Whirlwind would draw immediate respect and attention, while your demonstrated ability to neutralize threats without fatalities represents exactly the approach we wish to cultivate." Eleanor considered the offer thoughtfully. "I've established roots here in Copper Springs. My students, the community—" "The academy would be based in Denver," Jenkins acknowledged, "but would operate seasonally, allowing you to maintain your ranch and local teaching commitments. The position comes with considerable compensation and the opportunity to literally reshape how law enforcement approaches firearms throughout the territories." Through the window, Eleanor could see her students reassembling for the afternoon session. Young Lily was helping Tommy adjust his stance, while Charlie Parker distributed targets with methodical care. What had begun as informal lessons had evolved into something more significant, a philosophy of responsible marksmanship spreading ripple-like from Copper Springs. James would have appreciated the irony, she observed with a small smile. The exhibition shooter who avoided violence became the teacher of those officially empowered to use it. "He would have been proud," Jenkins corrected gently. "You've transformed personal tragedy into a legacy of positive change. Few manage that alchemy." After Jenkins departed, Eleanor rejoined her students for the afternoon session. The marshal's offer remained undecided, requiring careful consideration rather than an impulsive response. For now, her focus remained on the immediate responsibilities before her. "Mrs. Montgomery," Lily approached tentatively during a break in the practice. "Pa says you might be leaving Copper Springs to teach in Denver. Is that true?" Word traveled swiftly in small communities, Eleanor reflected, especially when the marshal visited someone specifically. "It's a possibility I'm considering," she acknowledged, noting how the nearby students had quieted to listen. "But nothing's been decided." "But who would teach us if you left?" Tommy asked, genuine concern in his young face. "I wouldn't be leaving permanently," Eleanor clarified, "and many of you have progressed to where you could help instruct beginners." "Charlie?" Parker nodded thoughtfully. "Like how you've been having me work with the younger kids, building a program that continues even when you're not here." "Exactly," Eleanor confirmed, impressed by his perception. "True mastery includes passing knowledge to others." As the afternoon session concluded with the promised demonstration, Eleanor indeed shooting a silver dollar from the air to the students, amazed applause, she found herself contemplating Jenkins' offer with growing interest. The opportunity to influence territorial law enforcement represented a chance to extend her impact far beyond Copper Springs, to transform tragedy into meaningful change on a scale James would have wholeheartedly supported. Samuel Parker joined, her as the students departed, helping gather the remaining equipment. "Quite the fanfare about the marshal's visit," he remarked casually. "Town's buzzing with speculation." "I imagine they are," Eleanor replied with a knowing smile. "Though I notice you haven't asked directly what he wanted. Figured you'd share." "In your own time," Parker responded easily. "Whatever it is, as you are thinking deeply, that's plain enough to see." Eleanor appreciated his perception and restraint, qualities that had made Parker a valued friend since her arrival in Copper Springs 5 years earlier. "He's offered me a position teaching marksmanship to law enforcement officers in Denver. Seasonal work that would allow me to maintain my ranch and continue the local training program." Parker nodded thoughtfully. "Sounds like an opportunity to extend what you've started here, taking the Golden Whirlwind's philosophy to a wider audience." "That's how I'm beginning to see it," Eleanor agreed, securing the last of the practice. "Targets. When I first came to Copper Springs, I was running from who I was, trying to bury my abilities along with my grief. Now you've found a way to honor both your gifts and James's memory," Parker finished with understanding. "By teaching others to use similar skills responsibly." As sunset painted the mountains in amber and gold, Eleanor stood in her training ring long after the others had departed. Sundance grazed nearby, occasionally lifting his head to check on his mistress with the attentive awareness that had made him such an exceptional partner over the years. The past 6 months had brought unexpected healing, not by erasing grief or trauma, but by integrating those experiences into a life recommitted to purpose. The Golden Whirlwind was no longer a persona Eleanor needed to hide, nor a legendary status that defined her limits. Instead, it had become simply one facet of a more complex identity: teacher, survivor, protector, community member. Doc Sullivan found her there, his evening visit becoming something of a tradition since the confrontation with Blackwell. "Contemplating the marshal's offer?" he asked, joining her at the fence. "Wondering what James would think of it," Eleanor admitted. "Whether he'd see it as the right path forward." Sullivan considered this thoughtfully. "I only met your husband briefly during that exhibition in St. Louis, but I remember something he said while watching you compete. A gentleman nearby remarked that it seemed a shame for such talents to be merely entertainment." Eleanor turned to him with interest. "What did James say?" "He said, 'My wife doesn't perform to entertain. She demonstrates what's possible. This entertainment is incidental to the lesson.'" Sullivan smiled at the memory. He understood that your exhibitions were never about spectacle. They were about showing others that precision mattered more than power, that control trumped speed. The recollection struck Eleanor deeply, capturing James's understanding of her approach to shooting in a way she had never articulated herself. Teaching lawmen to prioritize accuracy over intimidation would certainly align with that philosophy. "It would extend it to those who most need to learn it," Sullivan agreed. "And you could still maintain your roots here, continue building what you've started in Copper Springs." As twilight deepened toward evening, Eleanor made her decision. The path forward wasn't about choosing between her past and her future, between the Golden Whirlwind and Eleanor Reed, between private contentment and public responsibility. It was about integration, bringing all aspects of her experience into a cohesive whole that served a greater purpose. Tomorrow, she would send a telegram accepting Jenkins' offer. The Golden Whirlwind would ride again, not as an exhibition performer, but as a teacher carrying forward a legacy of precision, responsibility, and the judicious application of hard-won skills. Standing in the gathering darkness, Eleanor felt a sense of completion, a circle closed between who she had been, who she was now, and who she would become. The threat to Sundance had triggered a chain of events that ultimately freed her from hiding, restored her true identity, and opened new possibilities for meaningful contribution. As she finally turned toward the house, Sundance fell into step. Beside her, the loyal Palomino's presence a constant thread connecting all chapters of her remarkable journey. Together, they walked toward home, silhouetted against the last golden light of day, a legendary partnership reborn not for fame or glory, but for the quiet satisfaction of living authentically and serving purposefully in a world that desperately needed both. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.